Okay. We're going to go ahead and get started. Do all the mics work?
They should.
Okay, but I don't have to computer control those?
Okay, that one works.
No, they're just, they're on.
We're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to Law and Licensing Committee. We have a new committee with one board member that's remaining from last year. Board member Brittany, or Vice Chair Brittany Cummins is the member from last year. So welcome and thank you all for coming today. I'm Elisa Ellis. I will be chairing this year. And we're going to go ahead and just go around and introduce ourselves because it's a new year and we have some new board members this year that were recently elected. So we'll go ahead and start with our staff right here to tell who they are.
Hi, good evening, everybody on the committee and in the audience. My name is Angie Stallings, and I'm your Deputy Superintendent of Policy, as well as the main staff member for this committee.
I'm Kathy Helgeson. I'm the Committee Secretary for Law and Licensing.
Jenny Earl, a new school board member, and I represent District 1, which is Northern Utah area. So,
I'm Brittany Cummins, board member representing District 6, West Valley, West Jordan, Taylorsville, Kearns area.
Cindy Davis, a new board member representing District 9, which is north of Linden, most of northern Utah County, around to Goshen, Genola, and Alberta.
Thank you. Just hit speak.
Okay. Carol Lear. I'm a board member representing District 7, that's Salt Lake City and Park City. And also, I have the auspicious honor of being the vice chair of this committee. And I didn't even know that was a thing. I guess that's what you get when you, I guess that's the booby prize, and I got it. So thank you.
Okay, thank you all for coming. We are starting a couple minutes late, and we have a hard stop time at 9 p.m., and so I'm hoping to get out of here at 8. So that's the goal. And if I just wanted to give a little bit of order. We're going to be using Robert's Rules of Orders, and so it just helps all board members to be able to express their opinion. So if I don't call on you, I'm going to try to keep track of who's spoken so that we let all board members speak before we have second chances at speaking. And I'll try to be very careful at making sure we're speaking to the motion after motions are made, and so that hopefully things can run smoothly. But thank you all for coming. We're going to go ahead and get started with item 6.1, which is a discussion on LEA third-party provider monitoring. I'm going to turn the time over to Deputy Superintendent Angie Stallings to give some history on to why this is being discussed today.
Yes, great, thank you. For committee members, some committee members, this will be a reminder, and others, this will be a summary introduction. Back in approximately June of last year, an item was referred to this committee, which is Rule R277417, and there was a discussion about whether or not that rule should be amended or updated based on some information and feedback from mostly LEAs, school districts and charter schools. In October of last year, staff prepared some amendments to R277417, draft 3, I believe is what it was. And based on the committee discussion, the committee at that time did not take any action on the rule other than to direct staff, as it says right there. The committee directed staff to update R277100, which is the definitions rule. That action took place in November and December, and this committee did make a recommendation to approve a version of R277100. So that was the first step that we took. Now we're on to the second step of what the committee directed, which was to take Section 4 of R277417 and put it into its own rule. Also, a sub B to that motion was that we incorporate certain federal guidelines monitoring subrecipients for federal programs into the new rule. Between October and today, staff has worked on some different variations of that rule, and we realized that we probably need more discussion and feedback from the committee on key issues before we could bring back a rule with language that would be ready for the committee to approve. So there's no specific rule ready for you to review, meaning we don't have a rule with line numbers and amendments, other than for your information at the bottom of this board docs item, you'll see an R277115, which is attached, which is essentially Section 4 of 417, which was put into the rule, with the addition of some language that's in 53E-3-401, subsection 10, about the board's authority to include some language about LEAs and their contracts with third-party providers. And so when that language passed a couple of years ago, for some reason, one reason or another, the board never then codified that language into a board rule. And now that these third-party monitoring provisions have been separated from the incentives and disbursements language in 417, it makes sense, if we're going to have a standalone rule about LEA monitoring of their third-party providers, to codify that language in 53E 3-40110. So that is 115, but again, it is not ready to be, we do not recommend, staff does not recommend that the board take action on any specific draft rules tonight, but instead I provided that for your information. So as staff, what we would recommend doing, and this is an effort for us to receive some more direction and feedback from you, and to also allow members of the public, if the chair agrees, to allow members of the public to provide feedback and recommendations, is to go through these three kind of key questions. And there may be other questions or policy considerations that committee members would like the group to consider and provide direction to staff on. And we also provided links to the federal subrecipient regulations. They're kind of at the bottom of the board docs item. I don't know that I'll speak too much about the subrecipient regulations. I'm not as much of an expert on them. But as staff, I think we wondered if those regulations aren't quite apples to apples to the way we run our state laws and our relationship with LEAs and their third-party providers. It may not be as analogous as the subrecipient regulation. Now, we may be able to learn things from that and incorporate principles from there, but I just provide that context to you. So if you don't mind, Chair, would you like me to go through the questions?
Yes, please, let's
or?
go through the questions.
Okay.
And I may pause between each questions to see if there's public comment to each question instead of making them wait. So,
Before she got started, can I ask a question?
yes, please.
Would it be possible, I mean, is one option, Angie, to incorporate those federal regulations by reference? So if we find they're analogous, we find that they should apply, which I'm hard-pressed to see how they, unless we can find some difference between our situation, it seems like the federal regulations have to apply to the work we do.
So there's a nuanced answer to that, twofold. Absolutely, we could incorporate elements of those regulations into our rule. The term subrecipient is a term of art in the federal world that is a little different than what we're calling, than our relationship with LEAs generally, or LEAs' relationships with third-party providers. So I think because subrecipient is not a term we use anywhere else, we'd probably want to use the term third-party provider. So just incorporating them by reference wholesale may not work, because subrecipient is not used anywhere else. It's not a term, except for with federal programs, that would work. And if Assistant Superintendent Natalie Grange or Director Debbie Davis, they have a lot more experience and knowledge about the federal regulations than I do, and probably
You could just be on deck.
Director Ben Rasmussen also. So I would ask that they correct anything I say, which they should do all the time, but today especially. So we could do something like that. I don't know that it would be as easy, though, as incorporating it by reference in a section that just says we incorporate these regulations. I think they're too complex to do that.
And just one short follow-up. At some point, then I'd like somebody to explain, again, not today, it sounds like this is more conceptual, but I'd like somebody to explain the difference between our third-party provider situation and a subrecipient, because it's possible that a
We can do that right now.
subrecipient
Yeah,
could be just like that. I don't need it today, it sounds like it's too technical.
No, it sounds like, by the nods I'm seeing in the audience, that at least Natalie Grange may be willing to talk to that to some extent, as well as Debbie. So would you like to go through the 3 questions first, and then we can move? Or
We
what?
can answer that question
Or do you want
first.
to do it now?
And I don't want to derail.
Otherwise, I don't want anyone
Okay.
sitting here wondering what they are before we even start the conversation. So. A long walk. Just make sure you state your name
Sorry,
and
I'm
title, please.
so spread out, sorry.
Okay, Natalie Grange, the Assistant Superintendent for Financial Operations. It's a great question, and I'll try to answer it as quickly as possible. Subrecipients are used, like Angie indicated, they're a term of art related to when an entity is delegated the responsibility to fulfill terms, agreements, effectively. And a good example is our LEAs are given the authority to delegate or to determine if a student is eligible to receive special education services. So they have some roles and responsibilities, and then some associated obligations that go along with those. In the federal regulations, there's a distinction between a subrecipient and a contractor. So oftentimes LEAs hire someone to help them fulfill those fiduciary responsibilities. So in the realms of special education, they may hire an interpreter, they may hire an occupational or physical therapist. We don't delegate responsibilities to those contractors to fulfill the roles and responsibilities that are delegated to like an LEA. So there's kind of a nuance, and if we just said subrecipient for every time we gave people money, it doesn't always mean the same thing, and it doesn't always have the same obligations and responsibilities and associated corrective actions necessary if laws and regulations aren't followed.
So, can I ask her something?
Yes, go ahead.
So it wouldn't be helpful to just start using subrecipient, is what you're saying?
So the federal regulations are written from the perspective of a prime recipient, which right now is the state of Utah, the State Board of Education, and our relationship with our subrecipients. So our subrecipients are our LEAs, and in some cases, nonprofits, community-based organizations. We delegate or we authorize our subrecipients to do certain things or take on certain responsibilities through grant agreements, sometimes through MOUs or interagency agreements. We don't, right now, give our subrecipients the right to then recipient out their responsibilities, right? They always have the option to hire contractors or specialists or individuals to help them with their fiduciary responsibilities. But right now, we don't carte blanche just say, here's some money, maybe get somebody else to help you with this. Like we try to kind of keep those things limited. And the concern that we had about just starting to use that term, it would be to give, it would effectively change our business practice. And I'm not sure that was the intent of the committee.
That's helpful. Thank you for letting me.
Thank you. So we'll go ahead and start
Clear
with
that up.
question number 1. Thank you, Natalie.
Great. All right, and I am trying to scroll back up to.
Sorry, I can.
No, you're fine.
It's which goods and services should the rule apply to?
So I'll give you a little bit of context of what I'm trying to find out, or the feedback we'd like from the committee. The language that is in 417, Section 4, which would now become part of a new Rule 115, is really limits those monitoring requirements to contracts that the LEAs enter into with entities to perform core instructional services. So it would be like, I'm going to contract with this teacher or with this private school or with a program to essentially act as the teacher of record in some ways, to provide the day-to-day instruction to the student, to monitor curriculum, to monitor the student's progress, determine whether or not they in fact met the core requirements in math, or whether they're ready to get a diploma from the LEA. So it's really at the heart of what the school does. I think that when you talk about what is the business of our public education system, it's the academic instruction that we provide to students. And so 417 limits those monitoring requirements only to contracts with providers who essentially take on that role as the primary instructional service provider. It doesn't necessarily apply to the contract with your landscaping provider or your accountant at this point. So the version of 417 that we brought back in October expanded that. One version expanded it completely to arguably apply to your landscaping services, accountants, et cetera. But in the draft 3 that eventually came to the committee, it was limited to primary financial services that are contracted out, meaning those services that a district business administrator legally is required in Utah code to perform, and then data submission services. And I'll provide that, the reason why the staff included those two groups. Part of it has been with our experience with certain providers and LEAs. When an LEA contracts with a third-party provider to perform their core financial services or their data submission services, when we've had problems with the data we've received or trying to verify, for example, that a school actually has 100 students versus 200 students, or figuring out hours, days of membership that the student attended, or whether or not they've met certain legal requirements. It seems that there's times when the LEA, meaning the district or charter school, has a hard time getting that information from the third-party provider, and that those are kind of the core things that oftentimes our office is interested in. We're interested in the instructional services, whether they're teaching to the core, whether they're, monitoring student progress, diplomas, et cetera. Number 2, we're interested in their financial stability, because often we get called on, the state gets called on to account for how our LEAs are doing, and we need financial data to distribute money. And then the third thing is the data submission. As you know, we collect tons of data, and again, most of that we use to report back to the legislature or to the federal government on behalf of our school districts and charter schools. The third option would be to just open it up to every single third contract. So you could include the landscaping services and the accounting. I don't know that we as staff ever meant for it to go that far or have a recommendation for that, but if the board would like to have these monitoring requirements apply to every contract that an LEA enters into, that would be kind of option 3.
Okay, thank you. Board Member Cummins?
So when you began your explanation, Angie, is it all right if I clarify our question? You said in the code it spoke specifically just to instructional services?
The current.
The current
Rule.
Okay. Because sorry, can I continue clarification? The code talks about educational service, which is what you're talking about in option B, is that correct? Where things that are required by the state or under this code or under board rule that is authorized under this code would also be under these same possible regulations, is that correct?
May I answer?
Yes.
Okay. So yes, the term educational services is very broad in the code, and it's not defined. You could argue that educational services applies to anything and everything. So I think it's up to the board. Do you see where in the code it talks about educational services?
Are you
Let me go
looking
back.
at 53E34?
Okay, it means a good or service that's required or regulated under this public education code. So not everything, but I think anything in what used to be 53A, so now 53E, F, and G.
Right.
And we probably may need more clarification on what that means, but that's the educational good or service. Our rule actually doesn't define instructional service, but I think some people have interpreted that to be fairly narrow compared to educational good or service. And financial and data submission, I would argue, is absolutely in 53E, F, and G, because there's a lot of financial requirements in there. We require them to provide data. We distribute money based on data. But anyway, that's probably more complex, and maybe I'm not answering your question. But there was in the definition in 417, but I think you could make an argument that 417 narrowed that by the way they use the term instructional services.
Board Member Lear? Or
I was
Vice
just going to
Chair
ask
Lear?
where she was looking in the code.
Yes, it was the one that's
And I
linked in our.
can't see that, and that's behind me, so.
It's linked in our doc,
So it's-
53E.
So it's 341.
It's
341.
401, yeah.
Yeah,
Okay,
53,
thank you.
341.
Great, got it.
Does anyone else have any questions or comments? On this one, go ahead. Oh, sorry, I didn't see your light. Board Member Davis?
Just a question of how we're defining monitoring. I'm looking at R277-115, line 8 through 11, which says that it allows the board to require an LEA to require in a contract with a third-party provider that the third-party provider shall provide upon request of the LEA information necessary for the LEA to verify that the educational good or service complies with these laws or rules. But where it says upon request of the LEA, I'm then assuming that this is not prescriptive, and we're not giving a prescriptive definition of monitoring saying LEA must do A, B, C, and D in order to monitor a third-party contractor. But if the LEA has a request, then the third-party contractor needs to give the information that they request. Am I accurate in that, understanding that definition of monitoring?
Yes, and that actually jumps us to that kind of, you're moving to the third question, or is it the third or the second question, which is, do we want to provide more specific direction as to what that means, what monitoring means? Right now, it's fairly broad. The language you stated is almost not word for word, but it's very closely matches the language in 53E-4-301 subsection 10. You'll see right here, the board may
That's what I was
require a
reading.
rule. Yeah, okay. So that term monitoring is not defined in this. So it hasn't been explicitly defined. We, as the board, often have the opportunity, blessing, burden, whichever word you want to choose, to provide more clarity in rule when, for example, monitoring isn't defined in statute. You may decide to leave it and do nothing with it and allow there to be discretion, but then when it comes time for auditing and other times, you get questions about, was the LEA's monitoring practice, were they sufficient or not? And so if you wanted to say their monitoring plan needs to include at least A, B, and C, that's really what my question number 2 is would you like to add?
I was going to say monitoring is defined in R277-100.
Oh, thank you.
Oh, good call.
Discussion.
Sorry, that wasn't on the mic, so I'm going to repeat that. Ben Rasmussen said that monitoring is defined in 100.
And I could pull that up if you'd like. It's right here.
But-
Board Member Lear.
But if we wanted to, our definition of monitoring
Right.
per R277-100 could change too.
And
So
or,
it's not set in stone, because it's our
Correct.
rule also.
Yeah.
correct. The monitoring
Yes.
here is probably not meant to be, we probably would want a more specific definition of monitoring in 417 or 115, and we could change it.
Yeah. Director Davis, could you just state who you are and your title?
So Debbie Davis, Director of Internal Audit for the State Board of Education. So the definition of monitoring that we just added to 100 actually has come out of several conversations about confusion about auditing and monitoring. And so we wanted to try and make that really clear. So monitoring as it is currently defined in the rule in 100 is more about how the USB, how we need to go monitor and what that might be, rather than how an LEA might go monitor, which is what 115 or 417 is talking about. So there could be differences there based on if we're talking about how the state needs to go monitor, or what that might look like, versus how an LEA might go monitor and what that looks like. And what Assistant Superintendent Grange was talking about, there are specific standards in federal guidelines that's part of this whole discussion, things we have to do for monitoring. We are required by the federal government to do it, and we've had several audit findings about our monitoring. So we need to be very clear about the distinction when we're talking about monitoring. Are we talking about federal monitoring we do for federal standards, monitoring we do for state standards? Is it state monitoring we're doing? Is it local monitoring that's happening? So I just think keep that on your radar as we're having this discussion, because there are some very specific requirements.
Thank you. Board Member Lear?
So it seems to me, and this is the middle of the conversation, not necessarily an answer to your question, but one conclusion maybe we can draw is that monitoring needs to be defined for purposes of this rule rather than just using the definition we have that already exists. So that would be my, I don't know that it needs to be a motion, but that would be one sense that I'm getting from this discussion.
Thank you. We're not, this is just on the agenda as a discussion, so we cannot take official motion.
Oh, that's even better.
Okay, I'm sorry I failed to recognize Board Member Earl.
You're all right. Jenny Earl, I guess I'm just asking questions. I'm trying to get maybe caught up on speed and everything here. Is there specific issues that we're trying to correct with this? Yes, there is. So that's what I'm wondering. I'm wondering, what are we correcting? What's the errors that have? Do you know what I'm saying? Or why are we delving into this? I'm asking just historically so that I understand kind of the why, not necessarily. Do you know what I mean? Does that make sense? So I can further understand the direction we're headed.
I'm guessing you want to answer that, but I'm just going to say I think that it depends on who you talk to, don't you think?
I was going to say that, yes.
Yeah, there's been a lot of back and forth on this particular rule, on why it came, different things. Originally, the audit committee made a motion that this needed to be looked at 417. Anyways, but this particular portion didn't really, there's a lot of different perspectives on what happened. So we're here and I don't know how to really get into this. Yeah, you tell what you think.
Just one other.
Everyone has a different story.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Specifically about this discussion today, I think that's what Chair Ellis articulated well. However, the Rule 417 in general, I guess I can't speak to it completely because it began before I actually joined the State Board of Education, and I don't necessarily want to put other people on the spot who are in the audience, although people are pointing at Assistant Superintendent Grange. There were audits. I'll just try to briefly say this, and then if you would like more information, we could bring her up.
Or you could talk to someone later,
There
too.
were some audits performed back in 2014, mostly, as well as then some additional audits in 2016 and 2017. Natalie Grange was a former director of internal audit. She's now the assistant superintendent of operations. So essentially, Natalie used to have Debbie's job. Both the audit department back in 2014, as well as I think 16 and 17. We've done quite a few audits. I want to round up and say probably about 15 audits total of different charter school districts and charter schools. More school districts than charter schools. And based on those audits, there was a decision that 417 was necessary. So the first version of what is now 417 was enacted back in late 2014. And then another version came out in early 2015. So we then updated it again one more time in late 2016. I want to say about December 2016, January 2017. We received some additional information from some audits, which is what triggered the June discussion in this committee about 6-7 months ago. So they've been related to audits, and one of us could provide you those audits
That
if
would
you'd
be
like
great,
to look at
because
those.
I want to know why we're headed in a direction, because
Yes.
that gives me direction as to what we want to end up with.
Yes.
Because otherwise, I'm like, why are we? I'm just wondering the why.
Can I offer one other thing?
please.
Yeah.
One other thing that I will send to you as soon as I can. In November of last year, Board Member Ellis and I actually testified before the Legislative Administrative Rules Committee, and I prepared a PowerPoint that I presented to the Legislative Committee, and it includes information about the audits, as well as, I believe, a memo that Director Debbie Davis, that I think if you looked at that PowerPoint, the memo, and then if you wanted to look at some audits, that might be really helpful.
Very good. Thank
Okay.
you.
Yeah.
Thank-
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and see if there's anyone from the public. So we kind of started to touch on question 2.
Before you do that, can I?
Yeah.
I'm still not clear what your question is, Angie.
My question is, do we want to leave the language as is, meaning limiting new 115 only to, LEAs are only required to do monitoring and have all of the regulations in Force 17.4 apply only to their contracts for instructional services? Do we want it to be instructional services, business services that are like a BA and data submission service? Or do we want to, yes, do we want to expand it or not?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Just a question on procedure, since this is a discussion item, how, as a committee, are we going to inform the next step? Are we going to take a committee vote?
I don't know, because it was originally, I thought, listed as an action, then it changed. And so I just don't know for open meeting laws if we can take a vote, but I think we can give we can give our staff direction. So we can do that.
I think that because the action you'd be taking is not binding, other than telling
Yeah, so you
staff
can do
what
that.
you would like us to do with the rule coming back, that there's no, Brian is not around, but my sense is it's not an action that's going to impact anybody other than Ben and I. So I think you could make that motion, if you want to give it some.
But I don't want to take motions until we've allowed public comment. Because once a motion's made, then the public can't we have to discuss to the motion.
But
Go ahead.
But I'm just saying, in the spirit of what Brittany was just saying and what Angie's response was, I'm happy to hear from the public, but ultimately what this committee says to you, I hope will be the controlling information that prompts you to send us a draft. That's what I was
Yes, of
getting
course,
at.
it would need to be a committee action
Committee
to her,
direction.
not,
So, I mean,
the
I'm
public
wondering-
can't direct staff to do
I'm wondering
something.
if public comment is necessary at this point, or is,
I think it helps us as board members get insight into what constituents are feeling or thinking.
that's fine.
So is there I don't have anyone signed up. Does anyone want to speak to any of this? Or we can wait until we get to more questions, so this isn't your one and only opportunity? Please just turn on the speak button and then state who you are and who you represent.
Hello, board members and staff. My name is Stan Lockhart. I'm here tonight on behalf of My Tech High, and we provide personalized curriculum for our partners, LEAs, who then make that available to their students. I just want to start by saying thank you for the opportunity to have a discussion. Sometimes when when you bring up a rule and it's proposed, and we find out about it a week before the board meeting, we just scramble trying to figure out what is the intent, what are you trying to do, why are you trying to do it, so that we can give appropriate feedback on what might work. And so the fact that we're here kind of trying to give direction to staff is a very positive thing in my opinion, and I just want to say thank you for doing that. Interestingly enough, on question 1, it could be any of the three. The fact that you want to take a small group of things and monitor it, or a larger group of things or a larger group, is not an issue that I think we have at My Tech High. It's more the methodology, it's more this definition of monitoring, it's more the how intrusive are you going to be at the LEA level, because up until now, the LEAs have had this responsibility, and it's been in their court, and you essentially are now taking some of what you've asked them to do in the past, and you're saying, now we're going to direct you to do something more. And done the wrong way, there can be an incredible cost of compliance for an unfunded mandate with an LEA. And so that's the challenge, is how do you do this if there's a problem? And Board Member Earl, there is a lack of clarity of what the problem is and why we're doing this. I believe staff when they tell me there is a problem. I have no question. If they're hearing from LEAs that there is a problem, then that I believe them. But it would be awfully nice, whenever a bill is proposed in the legislature, the very first thing that is asked is, why? And that's what you asked tonight, and it's perfectly legitimate. And the more clarity you get around the why, the better able you are to come up with just the right solution, because there's kind of this scale. There's a scale of draconian measures and no measures at all. And most of the time when we deal with statutes or rules, we're moving the needle in one direction or another. And heretofore, there's just been this feeling that we're moving in a more draconian direction. And by having this conversation today, I'm hoping that we can find solutions to whatever the problem is in a less draconian way. But the more clarity we could get over why, the better we can figure out where that exactly right solution can be. So anyway, on this first question, whether you do 1, 2, or 3, I have no problem if you decide that it's important that there's transparency among all of those who contract with school districts. That's fine.
Thank you. Is there anyone else from the public? Go ahead.
Terry Shoemaker with the Utah School Boards Association and Superintendents Association. I just want to second what Mr. Lockhart has said. School districts pay very close attention to third-party providers. They have to, for a wide variety of reasons. So I think you've asked the right questions. If you're going to pursue this policy, continue to go down that road. The question is, and I keep asking myself, what is the problem? I mean, the problem has not been clearly defined. And until it's clearly defined, it's hard to comment on, other than the fact that we know that somebody thinks there's a problem here. That's been the challenge. There's been a conversation with folks at the legislature about this. And again, it kind of comes about, what is the problem here, and can it be solved by board rule? Well, maybe it can be. But I'd like to know more specifically, what is the problem?
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, thank you. Let's go ahead and move on to, we touched on question 2, but there may have been other people that wanted to talk on that. I'm just going to repeat it. Should we include more specific requirements of what LEA should be prepared to report on, including what information should be explicitly provided? And sorry, unless someone wanted to make an action about number 1, but we could finish the discussion. Go ahead, Board Member Cummins.
Sorry, is it okay if we just resolve the first question?
Yeah,
prior to
sorry,
moving
that's what
on?
I just realized.
Okay. So I just have one question that I'd like to ask first. So in the code, it talks about the board making rules in regard to third-party contracts. It says that the LEA shall, so we'll make a rule requiring the LEA to require in the contract certain things, and that's already been taken care of. Is that correct? We've already made the rule that requires in the contract? I thought I remember something years ago.
So this was, this language came into being in the code in 2016. And I do not personally recall that we ended up codifying the language in board rule. So, and that may have just been that timing, we didn't have a third-party provider rule that it fit into nicely. We have quite a few different LEA requirements over their third-party providers and many other
I'm used to
rules.
raising my
Go ahead.
hand. Well, I just wanted to follow up on her question, not answer it, but would you say that by referencing this in your draft 115, basically it's saying that we require that the third-party contractor follows the education code and board rule authorized under. So it's not necessarily that there's something more specific. It's up to what we wanted to have happen.
I read, sorry, can I follow up?
Yep.
Sorry, when you read it, it says the board by rule may require that certain things be in the contract. So it's
Right.
not talking about the contractor, but the actual contract has to contain certain things
Right.
by board rule, as required in board rule. And then the LEA, or the board rule may also require the LEA to have certain verifications.
I was
Is that
just
correct?
wondering if the draft 115, if we didn't change it, would fulfill that requirement for a rule, because you're referencing that section that we expect them to be compliant with statute. That's what I'm
Sorry,
asking
can I-
Angie.
I'm starting to
Do you
spin
not
in my head.
understand what we're saying?
I think that I agree, what I'm following is I think I agree with Brittany that we should put this in board rule somewhere. And to answer, I don't think we've actually codified it in board rule anywhere. But was that what your question
So,
was?
yeah, my question is because it's the code isn't saying, it's not saying these things are required, it's saying the board by rule may require these things.
Yes, but so I think we're saying the same thing. I'm just wondering, draft 115 that isn't a rule yet, because you've referenced this, we can get more specific if we want, but as is, would it be compliant is what I'm saying. You could always get more specific because it's,
Sorry, last question. Just, I'm curious about just how the rule-making process works, is when you have in your authority and purpose, when you're referencing it, it's just giving you the authority and purpose. It's not actually saying this is the code, right?
Correct.
So that authority and purpose just says, here's the code that
authority.
gives us the authority. Now here's the rule
Correct.
that does that.
So you'll see, it's listed
I think
twice.
we're saying the same thing,
So
though.
it's in the authority, and then we've actually, and then included it in the rule. The thing, can I make a statement? I think that the nuance with this section of code that says you can by contract require certain things, or that the LEA, or that we, the board, you, the board, may require LEAs to include certain things in their contracts. I would argue that that language in 53E 3401 essentially opened up the door for you to say, when you're monitoring your third-party providers, these are the things that we're going to want, so that when you enter into these contracts with your LEAs, you'll know what it is we're going to want from you as far as accountability goes on issues about compliance with the law. So if you looked at student data privacy areas, you'd see it says, well, if you contract with a third-party provider if you have a tool, your SIS system, that's a student information system, you need to make sure that that SIS system is compliant with student data privacy laws, because student data privacy is very important to us. You can't just contract with a third-party provider and then they can do whatever they want. So we have elements of this throughout many rules. So we never codified this language explicitly, and we probably should have, but we have required in many, many rules, LEAs to monitor or ensure that the people they're contracting with follow the law, which I would argue is the heart of what 53E 3401 is trying to state. We never codified the exact language, but we've done elements of it, so that when LEAs were called on, not called on the carpet, I don't know if that's the right word, but let's say we had an audit go out, or Whitney's team went out and said, we've had problems, and I don't mean to name names here, but I'm trying to think of the name of an SIS system, that they have a security problem, and they're not handling student data well, then the LEA knows that these are the things that they're going to have to reach out to their third-party provider to show evidence that this system is student data privacy compliant. So it's and I apologize, I'm probably making this more complex than it needs to be, but I think today, more than ever, we absolutely need to codify that language word for word, because it seems to be the backbone of why we require all these other things in rules, where we say, you, LEA, need to make sure that your third-party providers and student data privacy do A, B, C, and D. Well, the reason we have that authority to do that in rule is because at some point the legislature said, we agree with you, board, Because there was a time in the past, I'll cut to the chase, where when the board would go to one of these school districts or charter schools and we'd say, we need this evidence of compliance, the district or charter school would say, sorry, we contract that out. We don't have that information. We can't give it to you. And we had to say to them, you've got to give us information because it's your responsibility, district or charter school, not the third-party provider.
Okay, I think we have a couple board member comments. I'm looking at the clock, and we're going to have to move more quickly on this item because we'll have another discussion later when it actually is written up. But Board Member Davis.
So just kind of trying to wrap my head around it. It sounds like items 1 and 2, it seems like going all three, 1, 2, and 3, seems like it goes really far. I don't know. That's just me. But having said that, what are the minimums that we need to do two things? One, to give us the information that we need for the reports that we have to make. And 2, what is the information that, is it Auditor Davis? What do I call her?
Director Davis.
Director Davis. What are the items that she needs to fulfill her federal responsibility to monitor? Because that seems to be the minimum basic line of what we would include in our language so that the work of the board can move forward and be compliant in these areas. And then other things that people want to add on top of that seems like they would be additions. But would it be helpful to know the basic minimum that we need first and then move from there to be able to do the work that we need to do?
So,
I mean, I like the flexibility in having LEAs be able to ask when they need, but I don't want to give flexibility if it's just going to continue to tie our hands and then this debate's going to go circle around again because we don't have the information we need to do our work.
just a little bit of clarification. Director Davis, the audit department doesn't go out and do all the monitoring. You might do some. I don't know if you don't do any. There's different departments in the building that do, but their audits are all based on board action. And so that's a big discussion, but maybe if you just want to get together, I think Director Davis could explain that, because they have a presentation, because it has been confusing because we use all these different terminologies and everyone thinks of audit, but they're all different. And so it would be helpful, I think, because it can be confusing. There's just all these terms that can be whatever. So that part isn't really applicable, except for some of the monitoring in other parts of the building. And we don't even know, that would be each department head having to come up. That'll be a big discussion to figure that out. Yeah.
If we need it, do we need it? Do we not need it? And if we need it, then let's get it on the table. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Or is it
I just read this differently than I think you guys do, because I think that we can just state we expect LEAs, when you create a contract with a third-party provider, that you're going to make sure that you're following state law in all areas. And I personally think it would be impossible to go through and list every single thing that we expect, because the education code is so enormous. And so for me, I look at it from a different perspective, because I just think, well, when does it stop and how does it start? Because it just seems to me like it would be huge. Because yes, I expect student data privacy. I expect a lot of those things. But I think the LEAs know that. So.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Yeah.
Really quick. So what is state law? Because I talked to a legislator this morning on this issue, and he said just about this very thing. And he said, I'm hoping to find some resolution that kind of falls in the middle, that doesn't go full bore one way or not enough in the other way. What is the law? Is there a law? Or
well, it says it in that section that you had up on the.
That said that we would make rules.
Well, I think that section that you set up that says when we contract with third-party provider, then they're expected to follow this education code and this. So we could go through and list specific things if we wanted, or we could just say, you're expected to follow this education code, and each district, I mean, some of them are smaller and don't have all the resources that they need to have everything memorized, and the statute changes so quickly, but, you know, we don't babysit every single thing that ever passes with the districts, and anyways, yes, you're
Can I
laughing at
talk?
me. Well, hold on, I think Board Member Cummins was before you.
Wait.
Okay, go ahead.
I see it much simpler, and it's interesting that you say that, Elise, because I feel every bit as strongly about public funds as some board members feel about student privacy. And that student privacy law and the board rules that came out of it and what we expect from LEAs and the specificity with which that expectation developed into a 15, and I'm exaggerating just a little for effect, policy that every LEA has to have about every element of student privacy that it then has toward its students. I would feel like that goes too far, in my mind. But I don't think just saying follow the law is enough. And so let me just propose a few things, and then we can maybe move forward. First of all, I think it'd be helpful. I feel, even though I've been involved in this conversation since about 2012, I still feel like we're just tiptoeing around an elephant in the room. So I think it might be helpful for you and Angie to give the presentation to this committee that you had to the Legislative Rules Review Committee, or a pared down version of it, because I think they went right to the heart of it. Why are you doing this? And you came back with, this is why we're doing it. And I think that we're kind of now talking around the edges of that. So I think that would go to the why that Board Member Earl wants. And it would go to the why that Terry raises and Stan raises and those guys. So I think that would be helpful. I also just think that, and this is going to Cindy's point about, about what's the bare necessity. My feeling is a little more global than that. The State Board of Education has responsibility for all the public money that leaves our hands. And we can't, we know, tell LEAs, we're going to come in and look at every contract you have with every third-party provider, whether it's for instruction or business services or football fields. But we can say this is public money, and the State Board is responsible. We are stewards of that money. And so we are going to tell you with some specificity that we need to be able to get from you what we need when we need it. And if that means that your contract with your third-party provider tells them that we will be giving this information to the State Board when they ask, and here's the laundry list of things, then I think it should include that. So that would be my proposal. I feel like we shouldn't tiptoe around this anymore because it's public money.
Thank you. I think that you're misunderstanding what I'm saying. There's so many different areas that there's already rules written about them and things that we expect. So we could try to go pull them all out if that's what you're asking. I
think it should be like the.
Or you could just reference,
like
we
student
expect you to
privacy.
follow R277 whatever, R277 whatever.
I would say use the student privacy code, rule, program as a guide and be as specific as that.
Okay. Board Member Cummins, then Board Member Earl.
So in reference to question 1, my opinion, or I guess my desired motion of the committee would be that we go with that second option, because I think it speaks most closely to what it says in statute, and what the language would look like. I'm not certain, but it basically covers, because what we're currently doing is basically just instructional practices, those who provide instructional services, whereas the code is talking about anything, which would include, anytime somebody has it's not always only those who are providing instructional services that have student data, right? And so obviously anybody who is providing that educational service that's not directly related to instruction would have to be compliant with privacy, et cetera, and reporting requirements. And so my recommendation would be that we use some form of the second option that would that, to me, sounds most closely related to what's stated in code.
So are you making a
So
motion?
I would like to make that committee motion.
But we can't really make a motion, can we?
So it's
Well, we can make a committee motion to direct staff.
that when they write this rule, that option 2 be their guiding
And
reference.
is option 2 the broader one?
Option 2 is a little bit more broad, where it's basically goes more to the fact where it's educational services, where if you're going to be into a contract with, huh?
And financial and data, does that include financial?
Yes.
Correct, so educational services, because those data and student privacy and finances are all under the education code. So that is what's stated in the code right there.
I am not going to quite accept it yet, just so I can let Board Member Earl, in case hers wasn't directed to
Yeah,
that
that's fine.
motion.
I just feel like I want more information first, is all I'm requesting, that maybe we wait one more month for some of these decisions to get some more information. That's just my thoughts, so that I can make a more educated, anyways, so I have more information to move forward
Okay.
on it, so.
So the motion on the table is that we direct staff to write a draft of the rule. You don't want to draft the rule, but look, yeah, go ahead, please.
And because we changed this from action to discussion, I actually had anticipated whatever direction you were kind of leaning toward giving us, writing it out, and then letting the board take a look at it in February, get their feedback, and then bring the rule back in March. But we could just direct staff, and we could actually bring a draft rule in February, and/or if you wanted more information, I'm planning to send you a lot of background information that might help. If you wanted us to come back next month and explore the why and discuss that, we are open to whatever you'd like. If you'd like us to continue more of a discussion next month or bring back a draft, we will do it.
This is you made a motion, so.
Did you say draft, or did you didn't say that?
Can I clarify?
Yeah, go
So I did say, my motion was when the rule is drafted, to incorporate the concepts of the second option. My only concern is if we just push pause, then we're going to be in the same place at that point as we are today. And so the benefit of having some motion is it gives us something to talk about and something to direction to go forward with. And so my only concern of just pause is what are the questions that we need to answer, and then where will we be next month when the discussion comes forward.
So the motion on the table is to direct staff to write a draft of the proposed R277115 that would expand requiring monitoring standards and requirements to third-party providers and contract for certain financial and data submission services. So I guess you need to write instructional services, financial and data submission.
And I should have said in addition.
In
That's
addition.
what it should
So
have been.
instructional business services
And data submission.
data services.
And financial, yeah.
and anything else that occurs to you as crucial when you're doing that?
So that's the motion on the table. Any discussion of the motion, Board Member Cummins?
Just to clarify, the motion, when I made the motion, wasn't intended to be, this, and this, but what is the right language that captures
Right.
that, where it is reminiscent of the code, where it says, here's the code. Anything that's connected to code and rule obviously is a contract that would be under this purview. And so I'm not saying that we need to use that exact language that's in that second option, but using kind of that idea of expanding it to educational services.
Okay, is there any other discussion to the motion?
I would just maybe argue that, I don't know that we're putting it on pause, but if we're going in a direction, but then we're not going in a direction a month down the road, do you know what I mean? We're headed somewhere, but then we're making decisions maybe not necessarily contrary to that, but do you know what I'm saying? We're putting efforts one way, and then maybe we'll redirect it. And maybe that's the way to go. Maybe it's some direction. Anyways, I'm not sure it's necessarily putting it on pause when you're gathering more information. Otherwise, you're putting energies into something that may not, you may go a different direction or add more to it.
Thank you. I I'm happy to look at drafts. I am still waiting for, I mean, I've sat on audit committee for a couple of years now and different things. So I wasn't part of audit committee when the audits were requested, but I did see some of the things come back, and I still am looking for the why myself. And so I am not interested in expanding our thing. But I'd like to see what it looks like. So I'm not going to vote for this, but if you're doing a draft, I would also like to see the current, how you would write the current one, if you would just keep it as 115, your draft. I like the way you have it right now, but
Sorry, I wasn't going to say.
go ahead.
I was going to say one more thing, but if that same question keeps coming up again, Elisa, that's why I say, so that's exactly what you had to say to the Administrative Rules Review Committee. This is why we're doing this. So why can't you just repeat it to us so everybody here can say we know the why? We may not agree with the why, but we know the why. And you are part of that. Did you
Right,
still
but
don't know the why after you had that
I
discussion?
still feel like everybody gave a different, why that draft of the rule came to Law and Licensing Committee. Everybody I talked to gave a different reason and pointed at who brought those provisions. Because at the time, it was a draft that's not here any longer, that it was monitoring a third-party provider, and then there's subrecipient, and that was,
Last thing, follow up. If we don't do this, then let's just quit. Let's just give up on it and say, you know what? They can do whatever they want with their third-party providers. Because I think we either have to move forward and do something about this after 6-7 years that I recall, or do nothing.
go ahead, board member comments?
I would just ask the question, speaking to the why, is, if we were to throw out all of the questions of the past and just focus on the fact that this piece of code exists and it's asking us to make a rule, is that enough why to move forward, at least to codify this concept that says, okay, anytime you have a contract with a third-party provider, you need to make sure that that third-party provider is compliant with code, right? And so is that enough why moving forward to just answer that question of are the contracts solid enough that the LEA has the ability to say, this is what I expect of you as my third-party provider, and it's probably happening in practice all over the state, right? And I would imagine that they are, because those LEAs know that they are the last person responsible for those. And so I imagine this is happening, but when it's not, there's nothing that says that you should be doing this, right? And so if we don't have it in rule. And so is that why enough to move forward, at least in the most simplistic manner? And so we can chat as we move forward with a draft as far as how big or how small the rule is, but is it enough of a why to say, here's something in code, let's at least say, you need to have at the minimum, we talked about the minimum, you have to have in your contract that the third-party provider is going to be compliant.
One last thing.
Sorry, board member Cummins.
One last thing. I wasn't, I really was done. But just to Brittany's comment, it doesn't say the board shall, it says the board may. So, you know what? We could just say, we can't, there's not consensus on this. Nobody knows why this is necessary, so we're not going to do it. So I just think we either have to go forward with something and then, like everyone else says, amend it afterwards when we know we see what our errors are. Or do nothing, or say we can't, there's not consensus.
So you don't, maybe do any of you feel that 417 and this section that's now been pulled out to put in 115, I feel like that was an attempt to try to do what you're wanting to achieve?
Let me look at it with that in mind. I don't.
Where you expected LEAs to do certain things, and that's why that we have a provision about third-party providers in the first place.
Well, first of all,
But you want to expand
Isn't this
it.
only limited to educational services?
It's instructional services.
Instructional services, yeah, I keep saying.
Right, so,
So I think that's one problem with it.
yeah. But I feel like when we talked about UHSEAA, did I do all the acronym letters right?
UHSAA.
Whatever it is. when I was first elected and we were talking about data and different things, that's a third-party provider in essence. Well, we were kind of talking about some of those. And so did any of that get incorporated when we created a rule there that would be, so it just seems like there's a lot of things that cover data to make sure that they looked at stuff. And I feel like we wrote that in a way that it wasn't just specific to that one entity, but we were expecting more. Am I remembering correctly, or?
No, I think that's not how I remember.
Well, I know that the original, we don't need to get in that battle, but I do remember
Oh, let's.
the original was before we were on the board, but the outcome, I feel like it was expanded somewhat, so it wasn't targeting only one entity.
Oh, Lisa. Of course it was. It just avoided saying so.
Well, I would expect, never mind, we'll just, go ahead, Board Member Davis.
Is this an appropriate time to second this motion?
It doesn't need to be seconded.
Oh, it doesn't?
No.
Because, and I'll just say why I think we would have a draft to look at where things are a little more, sounds like, fleshed out and incorporates the second piece, the financial and data piece, along with the instructional services. And then we'd also have this draft that we still have that we can still consider. That one wouldn't necessarily supersede this one, but that we could compare the two and see where we go from there, and maybe it's one or the other, or we do merge the two. But
That's a good idea.
could we agree to move forward that way?
Look at these new people
Right,
coming
so
in.
right now, we're just having the discussion to the motion, so that's why we are still talking. So as soon as everyone's lights are done, or I'll
And I
call
can-
it because we're running out of time, but are you done? So we'll go ahead and take a vote on the motion, which is to direct staff to write a draft 2 of R277115 that expands the monitoring of standards and requirements to third-party contractors for instructional services, financial and data submission services, and incorporating Board Member Cummins. I shouldn't expand on your, because she didn't want it just to be those things, so. So that is the motion before us. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? No. So we had Board Member Cummins, Board Member Davis, and Board Member, you guys, it's confusing because I see Board Member Lear, I see everyone else's names. And then in favor, and then Board Member Earl and I were a no. Thank you. So we're gonna leave it here, and we'll bring up the third question at another time, because we have spent an hour on this, and I am not gonna reach my goal, and that's a problem, so. Okay, so we're gonna move on to 6.2, which is the State Online Education Program, R277726. And I'm gonna invite Ben, Corey Conth, and Diana, I'm guessing Sudreth. I couldn't see which Diana was here. Oh, it's not. Yes. Come to the table if you need to. And please state who you are. Yes.
So my only concern with moving on without addressing those is they're going to bring a draft back based on no feedback, and so we'll just discuss the draft instead of it in concept. Is that your thought?
Well, it's just taking so long, so I don't feel like we have time to cover it. So if we bring a draft, and then I want to get to those questions. And so it would just be another, I think we'll have to do another discussion item where it's just a draft, or in the meantime, if anyone wants to go through and have those discussions and ask staff, we don't have to make a motion to create drafts. So any board member could go through and say, I really want to see a draft that opens this up to monitoring everything. And anyway, so the third question was, how should the information be made available? And I don't know, I mean,
I can quickly say.
sorry, if you'll just be on pause for just a
So
second.
current practice is to essentially have the information available to USB staff who might be monitoring certain things, or auditors upon request, meaning the LEA maintains the information, but they don't necessarily publish it anywhere. One of I think draft 3 that came back in October actually required some posting of information on an LEA's website. And so we don't need to include that in there unless somebody thinks that would be helpful. The third would be providing information or reporting it proactively in some ways annually in some sort of a data submission to us, to USBE. So again, option 1 is current practice. Option 2 is not, and that's it.
So it's, yeah, go ahead.
Just, can I speak to that really quick? Because I think if we just have a quick, maybe I'm assuming it could be quick, but if we just move forward with at least some recommendation, then it would facilitate the conversation if there's a draft coming forward. So.
Yeah, we can do it. We'll see if we can do it fast. Let's let board member come and speak to it first.
So my motion would be to recommend option 1, which is providing information to USBE staff or auditors upon request. And so, because I feel like that is the closest to what the law is asking and requiring us to do. So.
Thank you. Before I make that an official motion, Board Member Lear, was yours different?
I agree with that. I don't want to make this hard on LEAs, but I think that the board is irresponsible if it does not have access to that information. It's public money. And I think that no LEA should want to or should hide behind the fact that the LEA is contracting out services to another entity. So I think absolutely it should be available on request. I don't want it to be any more convoluted or difficult, onerous for LEAs than that.
Thank you. Board Member Davis, did you want to talk?
I was just going to agree and say if we did put some kind of a posting or reporting requirement, if it could be done in like the aggregate, this much percent is going to third-party providers without siphoning out or making it an onerous report for LEAs, one more thing for them to have to do.
Is there anyone that opposes that direction? So I don't think we need to take an official vote. We'll just go ahead. Thank you. It's fine. I just was worried about time, so I apologize. Okay, thank you. Will you guys just please introduce yourselves, and then this one's not on.
So I'm Ben Rasmussen, Director of Law and Professional Practices.
I'm Corey Kant, the Statewide Online Education Program Specialist in Financial Operations at USBE.
I'm Diana Sudworth, Director of Teaching and Learning.
Oh, Natalie Grange, Assistant Superintendent of Financial Operations.
Thank you. So go ahead.
So we had this rule R277-726 before law and licensing back in November. At that time, there were some questions about different parts of the rule that needed, there was a feeling that we needed to resolve, and there were also some specific questions about the provisions of the rule related to third-party providers. We've brought the rule back for your consideration. I know we wanted to provide some additional background on the reasoning behind the provisions in the rule for third-party providers, and then see if we have any other questions about the rule. I think we've answered the questions that Member Hanson had specifically about the rule. There's some concerns there, but we do want to talk about the third-party providers.
Okay. Oh, well, I'm sure you can all hear me. Okay, so
Before you start, I should point out there are 3 drafts right now on board docs. Draft 3 is the most current draft prepared by staff. Draft 4 may be introduced by Board Member Lear later.
It's in board docs.
But draft 3 is the current staff recommendation. Sorry.
okay. I'm not sure which version to work with. I'm actually prepared to talk about the version 5 with the most recent amendments.
We don't have 5. We just talk about the.
4 is.
Okay, I guess that's 4. Okay.
Wait. No. So Natalie, did you guys
Okay.
prepare another draft?
On the third parties, I don't think 4 is substantially different.
Okay, no, it's not. I'm just wondering if the lines are different. Let's look at lines 369 to 386 and see if these are the ones we want.
So just for clarity's sake, I believe you're looking at the draft that's Lear, the
Yes,
Lear
I
amendments.
am.
And for those of us that most of us are new to the committee, it would be helpful if you just gave a brief summary of the differences between draft 1, 2, 3, and now 4. Just so that, especially if you're incorporating board member Lear's and then your technical changes all into draft 4.
So the only difference between draft 3 and draft 2 was a statement that was added in, it's highlighted in, The only difference is there's a statement that was added in that highlights that providers would provide information to the superintendent about the age that courses are designed for, so that that information could subsequently be provided to parents. That's the only difference between drafts 3 and draft 2. Draft 4 has a number of changes that board member Lear has suggested. They're all highlighted in either in brown or orange, so she can go through the rationale for those if she wants to, I think. But there's a number of changes there that board member Lear has suggested in her draft.
Yeah, we can speak to that now.
Did you want to do the technical changes and then we'll go to, I thought you said you had made some technical changes. Okay, so yes, please go ahead.
And the changes I made in draft proposed for draft 4 are almost all grammatical. Added some words that were left out, a number of things like that. There's only one substantive change that I would suggest is substantive, and that is was just, and that even that could be regarded as a clarification about who would be responsible if the online program wanted to suspend a student from the program. And then Ben and I had some back and forth about whether it should say suspend or expel. I think it should. I don't know that I feel super strongly about that. But if the kid did some horrible thing and looked at horrible material despite the fact that he was told that he shouldn't, and they want to kick him out of the online program forever, then who's responsible for the procedures to do that? And I just wanted to make it clear that it would be the provider. That's the only substantive change, and that is on
296.
line 296.
Yeah.
So who came up with line 78, the definition of under-enrolled student?
Oh, and then that was another one. I don't know that
Corey came up with that.
That's her definition. I did say that you've used this term, what does it mean? And then I suggested that they came up with less than the full load, and I said as defined by who, and then I suggested it said as defined by the LEA, because some LEAs think 5 is full enrollment, some say 6, so that it would be clear what an under-enrolled student was.
And in fact, we took that definition from law because law has a segment which relates to, it limits students from taking more than full-time enrollment when classes are aggregated across the primary LEA and the provider LEA. And that definition of full-time enrollment is developed by the LEA. So that's where that came from.
Okay, are there any other questions about that? I have a question. So for under-enrolled student, do they know if they are, say, to me it seems like they're most likely a dual enrolled student if they're only taking a little bit, no? Or, okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you don't need to differentiate those two?
No. And they may have a release time period or something like that.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I see no questions. Go ahead. Do you have anything else, Board Member Lear, that you wanted to?
And we will talk a little bit more about those amendments. Anyway, they were all so constructive and so wonderful. So we will talk about those. Okay, so just to get back to vendors, lines 369 to 386 in the copy that I have. Okay, so essentially this is very similar to what you've been talking about with vendors already, but the version that we have included in this rule is much softer, it really requires only that if a provider has a contract with a third party providing services to students that it's serving under the statewide online education program. And let me just say that that contract could be implied or expressed, so it may be written, it may not. We would ask that that provider has a monitoring plan in place, a written monitoring plan, to ensure that it can comply with, or that the third party is complying with certain areas of law, federal law, state law, and board rules. We're also asking that that monitoring plan provides that the third party will align the curriculum that it's offering with board standards, the core standards. And then we're asking that the provider LEA that's utilizing that third party has a plan for supervision of third-party facilitation and instruction by an educator licensed in the state of Utah, and that that educator be employed by the provider and reported as the teacher of record in our data systems, which would be Cactus, and we have a few other data systems that's going to be reported in. And the reason that that is important, if the teacher is reported in USBE data systems, then we can judge the licensing, background check, so on. We can also judge if that teacher's highly qualified. And only a teacher that's employed by the provider can be reported in Cactus, because Cactus is a mechanism for determination of funding distributed to educators. So if the provider is working with a teacher employed by a vendor, that vendor teacher should not be getting funding through the minimum school program, which Cactus, our data system, would determine. Did I lose anyone there?
Corey, could I add something?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think the intent of the monitoring protocol here, our LEAs have to enter into an acknowledgement or an agreement with the state online education program that they will meet all these standards themselves with the teachers that are employed by their LEAs. And so the requirement that if they contract out for those professional services, that the professional services meet the same standards the LEA has agreed to. It's mostly just to determine that we don't have a different set of standards between educators that are providing services that are contracted and those that are employed by the LEA.
So I do have a concern about specifying the employed by the provider or by the district. Sorry, I'm trying to find the line number. we're at.
It's provider.
382.
Provider. Could you put employed or contracted, just so that if there's teachers doing freelance work that are licensed educators in the state of Utah, but aren't necessarily considered employed, because someone that's coming in and just doing kind of freelance work on the side, it wouldn't necessarily be an employee.
We have considered that to be employed. They would be reported in Cactus as an employee, even though they're doing that
Okay,
contract
so it wouldn't
work.
prohibit them from being able to do side work.
Yeah. No, not at all.
Okay.
I think there was something additional I wanted to cover there, but I can't think of it right now.
Maybe we should throw it out to,
Yeah, sorry.
Just one thing that might be helpful, when this rule came back, when this rule came to law and licensing in November, and we looked at the third-party provider language, the committee's reaction was, don't address anything about third-party providers in this 726, because we've got 115 coming down. The reason why this is a bit of an exception is that third-party providers are not LEAs at this point. So that 417.4 does not govern So I'll give an example, and I apologize if I'm making this longer than it needs to be. But let's say that the student is attending a Nebo School District school. I'm trying to think of the name of the school there. Isn't there Maple Mountain? Isn't that Nebo?
That's down in.
Nebo High School. Okay, Nebo High School. And then they're taking an SOEP course from Mountain Heights Academy. Mountain Heights Academy at that point, when it comes to this program, is no longer the LEA. Nebo High School is the LEA. So we can't rely on 417 Section 4 for this very specific issue in SOEP. We need its own provisions because we're actually talking about Mountain Heights, who is an LEA, by the way, but we have to separate we need it to be more specific to SOEP in this place and can't rely on 115 because we've got two LEAs, but one is the LEA in the program, the other is an SOEP provider, and when SOEP provider contracts with a third-party provider, it has in the past impacted the LEA, meaning Nebo High School's ability to actually get funding. And there have been times when the LEA has not been able to get funded for that student because the provider contracted with a third-party provider and didn't do what now is the reason why we want this in SOEP. So we actually have a very concrete reason why this language is being recommended in here is because a general rule on LEA monitoring of third-party providers would not apply to SOEP providers.
Would it be considered split?
No.
No.
No. And can I just add a little bit more there? We have, when that, two things here. If the provider, which is an LEA, is working with a vendor, that these provisions will not relate to the provider working through the vendor with its own regularly enrolled students. Only with external students coming into it through the statewide online education program, which are actually the regularly membered students of another LEA. Okay, and moreover, state law requires that primary LEA, that other LEA, to open its doors and allow its students to be enrolled with this provider LEA. So we're just saying, so long as Nebo is required to allow Mountain Heights access to its students, we're going to give Mountain Heights some guidelines as to what it should be expecting from its vendor. Okay, and we found out in the past that because these vendors are not LEAs, they're not often schooled in or cognizant of all of those things that LEAs, that we take for granted the LEAs know. They're not aware of special education provisions, certain things they'll need to do for students. They're not aware of FERPA. They're not aware of data retention or records retention requirements and so on. So all this is doing is saying, provider, you should have a plan whereby when you ask your vendor for certain records or for data privacy or for access to an LMS system so you can judge attendance and teacher contact with the student, that provider has thought about those things and has a plan for being able to monitor its vendor and, to be able to have access to all of those things and have a better relationship with its vendor. We're in no way dictating how it should do that, the contents of a contract or anything else. We're taking an opportunity to provide guidance to our LEAs or our provider LEAs So they can better manage those relationships so that they can fulfill their obligations to the primary LEAs that are required by state law to allow them to access their students.
Sorry, I don't know who was first.
Go ahead.
Board Member Cummins.
So I'm just curious, the need for a written monitoring plan, would we have the same outcome if we just said they shall monitor the activities and services provided by?
Here's my thinking about that, and I shouldn't really speak out of turn, I'm sorry.
You're fine, go ahead.
Within our provider LEAs, they may change staff. If they don't have a policy written down, and this happens quite often with our provider LEAs, the second person coming in to monitor that program has no idea how they're supposed to be monitoring these vendors. They have no idea what to ask in terms of a vendor contract and so on. So unless they have a written policy for implementing these things, the same way that you would have a charter school have a written policy for its financial management or something like that, you don't have something stable on record, and that's how we have thought about it. But you could take written out.
Okay, Board Member, do you have a follow-up, or Board Member Davis?
This is perhaps a logistical, perhaps a substantive question. I'm not sure at this point, but so say a student from Nebo is part, maybe in Nebo, but they say and then goes part in Mountain Heights, and then Mountain Heights contracts with a vendor to provide some certain instruction, and the student has an IEP. Who is responsible for the IEP? I see in the language here, they have 72 hours to request it and send it, but who is making sure that the ultimate instructor at the end of the row is implementing the accommodations in the IEP with fidelity?
In terms of the accommodations, the provider would be responsible for seeing that their vendor is complying with the accommodations. The provider would be instructing the vendor in terms of the accommodations that need to be made, but the ultimate party responsible for that student in special education terms is the primary LEA of enrollment. And actually,
Back in Nebo.
yes, in another area of the rule, it states that if Mountain Heights, or just the provider, is found to not have ensured appropriate provision of accommodations, then when due process is carried out in a lawsuit or whatever is carried out here and brought to Nebo, the provider will reimburse the costs, any costs over here incurred at the primary LEA of enrollment, which is ultimately responsible.
So can I ask a quick follow-up? Who attends the IEP as the general educator portion of the team? The person who's working with the student every day as the vendor, or a provider who's not, but sort of legally responsible in case it goes awry over here?
Yes, that is covered in Section 8. Okay, we
I
have
miss
some
that?
amendments to the rule. When we get to the special ed amendments, we've actually covered that. Do we want to move on to that section?
Let me see if anyone else had questions about this section. That's fine. Go ahead and move on to that one, and then we'll.
Okay, so in terms of special education, in my section, there are two sections where we'll cover this, but Section 8.
Yeah, if you could tell us what line number.
Yeah, that.
Okay, so Let's first just look towards section 8, and then I'll be able to tell you the line numbers. There are a number of sections or lines through there that have been amended. Okay, so all of section 8 makes clear that the ultimate responsibility for IEP formation, management, so on, is with the primary LEA, and the primary LEA is directing a provider LEA. Okay, on line 410, we've added what we are trying to incorporate into rule what we've always advised a primary LEA to do, which is to include on the IEP team a member of the provider staff, okay? And we took out the word as necessary because in speaking together, Leah and I thought it's best to not just say as necessary, but to always have that presence available. So the IEP team will be composed of mainly officers of the primary LEA, but also an officer of the provider LEA.
But no provision saying if the provider isn't the one working with the kid every day, if it's a vendor or a third party, that person has no requirement to come and give input with the IEP team.
No, because essentially that provider
Is being monitored, or is monitoring the third party.
yeah, and they are responsible for what that third party's doing. Complex, yes, it is. Okay, so in terms of section 8, all of those special education provisions, I'm just covering these because we're already here. We come to line 421, which is where Board Member Lear made some suggestions for some changes. And here on line 421, we're talking about specifically about homeschool students and how special education services or a possible need for special education services is going to be treated by a provider LEA when that child wants to enroll in coursework through the statewide online education program. And initially, I had stated that on line 421, if a home or private school student participating in the program may qualify to receive special education services, then so forth. Board Member Lear felt that we should just take out may and put qualifies. This made us think about this very closely, and we decided that there was more we had to do to clarify this whole section. So on line 421, we would like to propose that instead of qualifies, we put in requests or may qualify to receive or something like that. So it would read, if a home or private school student participating in the program requests, moving to line 422, to receive special education services under the IDEA, the home or private school student, and then we would like to strike lines 424 to 427 and just move to the process that student will go through, which is on line 428. And we may have to, we're doubling up on language there, so we may.
That doesn't make sense.
Okay.
Because you put if, you're putting, if I may, Chair, I'm sorry.
Okay.
you're putting if, and then you're basically putting an if and then a colon, and then you're striking everything after that. So that doesn't make sense, the way
Okay.
it's written. We may need to talk about that.
Okay,
But we're probably
so,
getting broiled in some details where the
Right,
committee needs to.
Yeah, I'm,
okay, so then I think we would.
Hold on a second, Corey, I think.
Yeah,
well, I just am worried that we're going so fine tooth comb down. If we need to make an amendment to the draft, then maybe we just request some things and bring it back, or unless you feel like it's almost ready, but it just.
it is almost ready.
But did you
so
don't have that typed up, those changes?
We do.
You
I?
do, okay.
Go ahead, Natalie.
So I've been working with Leah Voorhees, who's in charge of our special education program, and we have a few little tweaks that we like to make. So if it's agreeable to the committee, could we make some minor modifications that do not change the intent, but make it more clear? Right now, the rule is kind of choppy and it kind of serpentines, and we'd like to just make it a straight line of if they want services, this is what you do. And we could bring that back. I don't know if you want that back in the next meeting, whatever your desires are. We do have two other quick things that we needed to cover, just so you're aware of why
That's
we'd like
fine.
to strike something.
I'm just wondering on if we brought this back and instead of moving it forward, is there a time constraint on this one?
I think it'd be okay.
It has been literally in process for a number of years, so I
Okay.
don't believe there's a time constraint.
Okay,
Maybe we should.
I think it will be okay.
yeah, so go ahead and cover those
Okay.
other topics, and then maybe we just need to go through
fine.
those again.
The one thing, so I believe it is substantive, and I wanted to make sure the committee was aware of it. Some of our other changes are grammatical and nothing huge. In draft 4 on line 390, there is some discussion about concurrent enrollment. An issue that we've been addressing for a while is how students in the SOEP program can have access to concurrent enrollment courses. As we were responding to some questions the board member Lear posed, we did a little bit more research and determined that we think that we have a conflicting issue with another statute. So right now, we're referencing concurrent enrollment courses as it pertains to 53F2409, which is in line 392. There is another statute, 53E10305, that actually discusses students that are eligible for concurrent enrollment. And right now, in the eligibility provisions, SOEP students don't fit into some of those categories. And so we think we have a statutory conflict that we need to resolve, and we feel that we should resolve that in the concurrent enrollment statute and rule, not in SOEP. And so our wish is that we could strike, or our desire is that we strike lines 390 through 395 as it currently pertains to concurrent enrollment, and we will bring that issue back in another format to be addressed at a later time.
Okay.
There is one other issue that was, yeah, go ahead.
Yes, please.
So, given the
Can you put your mic towards you just so we make sure it's heard?
given the history of this, the rather long history of this, what do students do in the meantime who want to do concurrent along with SOEP?
It has not been allowed since the inception of the
I
program
remember
in
that.
2012, and it is still not.
So it won't be allowed until this
Until we write it.
until this is cleaned up.
Well, and our analysis that admittedly occurred today and hasn't gone through Ben and Angie yet is that we have a problem. Right now, the other statute that I referenced requires a student to be able to be earning membership in order to qualify for concurrent enrollment, and that's a differentiating factor from those
And
students
they
in
wouldn't be
SOEP.
earning membership if he's in SOEP.
Correct. So probably Friday, we plan on bringing this issue in front of Angie and Jeff and talking through what potential changes we might need in statute that could help with that. We are not sure that we can resolve it
So
in
the
a
short
rule.
answer would be status quo, kid can't be in concurrent enrollment and SOEP until this is cleaned up.
I believe so, based on not being an attorney and what I read today. So
That never bothers
so-
anybody.
Someone else who is an attorney should opine on that. But we don't believe that we should be trying to solve a problem about another program in a rule that isn't necessarily related. So
Okay.
Thanks. That's all.
You said you had another section. So, really quick, Natalie, if you're bringing us back another draft, we don't need to make any movement. You can just write a draft striking those, but please just keep it in there so that it's there, obviously. But go ahead.
Just the last big issue that we were trying to tackle here was the recording of credit for 6th to 8th grade students that are participating in this program. The law states that the purpose of this program is to offer publicly funded high school courses. The program has always been open to it's been unrestricted, and then it was later restricted to 6th through 12th grade students. So there is a problem about recognition and recording of that credit. And the last set of changes that we were trying to make, or that we were bringing forward for your consideration, would give LEAs a clear process for recording that credit in the 9th grade year so that that credit can be recognized for purposes of high school graduation and post-secondary requirements. We were also putting forward a companion change to our 277-700 to make it clear that for purposes of this program, that credit earned prior to the 9th grade can be recognized or shall be recognized for purposes of high school graduation. So,
Okay. Thank you. I don't know that this is an action item, but I think we just need to send this back to make sure you get all those technical changes done and then bring us a draft incorporating, just adding to the Lear draft.
Okay.
Go ahead.
One last thing, and I'm only speaking for myself, not the committee. I think how you handled that is fine. I thought that, but I wondered if you're going to be looking at it again. That's a lot for an LEA to track. I wonder if there ought to be some language about the parent prompts the LEA to do the work so that the LEA is not expected to track that. And it may be too complicated to write that, but I just think that was my thought when I was reading that was that's a lot for a school counselor, I think, to track.
Natalie?
You're talking about the awarding of credit, is that correct? Right now, we have some limitations in our current system called SEATS. We're working towards trying to get that system updated and linked, right, I'm talking about the right thing, and linked to our UTREX program so that the credit could be part of an automated process so it wouldn't be so labor intensive. We are aware that we do have limitations right now, and that is a little bit of a longer term project, but that's one of our long-term goals is to make this easier to facilitate on LEAs and parents.
Thank you.
So we'll bring that back.
Yeah, so if you'll bring that back next month, thank you. Okay, we're going to move to 6.3, which is,
So-
did anyone from the public want to talk about that R277-700?
You said it was coming back, right?
It'll come back, so. Okay, so go ahead.
So 6.3 actually goes along with 6.2.
Right, it's 720 or 700.
Yeah, so I don't know if do we want to address this at this point, or do we
Or
want
wait.
to bring that back and do them both together? Because they're kind of companion.
Let's do them together.
That'll also give us some time for the public to get familiar with some changes we're proposing in draft 2 of Rule 700, which may have some impact on the LEA. So I think it'd probably be good if we bring both of those back together.
Okay, thank you.
Later on.
We'll go ahead and do that. I know. We still have things to do. Okay. Okay, 6.4 is R277304, Teacher Preparation Programs. Who's taking the point on this one?
Get off, Travis, or?
Oh, no, I do not want you to take it.
Okay, because
She means
Okay.
the monitor. You want to be able to.
No.
I don't want to be able to do it.
Okay.
Okay, so if you guys will please introduce yourselves.
Okay.
And your
So.
name, Ben, right?
If I may, R277304 is part of our ongoing process to revamp the licensing structure. We're following a timeline where we take rules one at a time here, and this month we have the teacher preparation programs with R277304. I think Travis will start that off with some highlights of the important elements to understand with this rule, or Diana.
Actually, Diana, Director of Teaching and Learning, is going to start off. I'm going to just give you a little background, since so many of you, like all of you, are new on this committee, and then I'm going to pop off to the other committee where I'm also supposed to be speaking right now. So I wanted to just give a little history behind what we're doing with the licensing. This is really something that began about 4 years ago when we started a collaboration with higher ed to look at teacher preparation and teacher licensing. We were able to get a grant at that time that has supported a lot of the work that we've done, including quite a bit of data collection that we've done with UEPC. Then about 3 years ago, it could have also been 4 years ago, the board had a task force that looked at licensing, and we spent a year working with that board task force and coming up with some different kinds of ideas. Most of those ideas came out in the general licensing rule that has already passed. As a part of our collaboration with higher ed, we were also able to use some of that funding to actually do more research, including some research that we did in Finland, where we were able to actually see how they do teacher preparation and really think about, are there ways that we could do a better job, because Finland has such a great reputation for the things that they do, and just kind of talking to some teachers that were actually prepared that way and seeing what the challenges were, because what you read in a book is always so perfect, and we wanted to see what the reality was. In addition, Travis especially has spent a lot of time in focus groups, talking to many different stakeholders, teachers, new teachers to see what went well in their preparation, what they wish had gone better, principals to see the same kinds of things, HR directors, superintendents, parents. I mean, the list just goes on and on. Travis has become the focus group expert here at USBE. So I wanted to give you kind of this history, because since this is a new committee, it sort of seems like, oh, wow, here's this new rule, and Travis I'm going to abandon Travis, I'm sorry, but he's so good at this. There are some huge changes in this that are the result of all of this research, the visits, the focus groups, and so Travis will take you through those things, but I just wanted to make sure that you were aware of kind of that history of where we came from, and to see how this fits not only with what the board has already passed, which is the general structure, but also you will, as this committee, be seeing many more rules as we continue to do this complete licensing restructure. Well, in my opinion, it's probably the most important work that this committee will do. So it's a really big deal. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Travis and get on to the other committee.
Good evening. My name is Travis Rawlings. I'm the Educator Licensing Coordinator for the Utah State Board of Education. With the chair's permission, I would like to, I wasn't intending to walk you through every single line of this rule. At least I hope you didn't want me to do that.
Please don't.
But I thought I would give you some major points, some of the big changes, some of the things that have brought up concern. If you notice in board documents, there's a feedback summary document that I prepared so that you are aware, because this was distributed to both board members and the public in November for comment, and so we took that comment and incorporated it into it. So, just to start out as an introduction, this is the rule that governs the requirements for preparation programs of teachers. That, in this new licensing system that the board has been working on and passing, that means university or LEA. That a program could be a university program, it could be an LEA, it could be something else. Ultimately, the rules are written such that these are the standards that the program must meet. Doesn't matter if I'm an LEA, doesn't matter if I'm a charter school, if I'm a university, these are the things that I must meet to be approved by the board to be a preparation program of teachers. So as you look through this rule, and I know you all hang on my every word when I write these things and don't fall asleep when you read them like I do when I'm writing them, that it really, there's a lot of language in there that's really dense. But ultimately, it boils down to what are the changes, what are the concerns, because the universities have chewed on this, UEA has provided feedback. I did get feedback from a few educators, but not necessarily any LEAs per se. And what this rule is really doing in a major sense is it eliminates, for lack of a better term, the language of student teaching and intern from board rule. It replaces that with the term clinical experience and then defines that term in a much broader sense. So the current rule talks about that you have to have a student teaching experience and it goes through these steps. It has to be this and has to be 400 hours and X, Y, Z, all those things. And ultimately, this rule eliminates that. It says it's not about a specific number of hours. It's about demonstrating specific competencies, demonstrating the specific skills and knowledge that you need to be an effective teacher. And so that's what this rule is going into. In terms of structure, if you're looking at the rule, it does start out with a general section. And that general section would apply to all areas that are considered teacher areas. So elementary, secondary, special ed, there's a number of different ones. So there's a general section. And then beyond that, it hits specific requirements for the various license areas that exist. So elementary versus secondary versus CTE and deaf education, all of those different types of license areas that are considered teachers. As we looked at these, when you say, we're no longer going to say 400 hours of student teaching, we need to replace that with something, because the goal is to say that these people that receive a license have demonstrated the skills and knowledge. So, for example, in one of the general sections, it talks about that a candidate must have had opportunity to must have demonstrated implementation of the full teaching cycle, including varied instructional techniques, instructional planning, assessment, reteaching, remediation, all of those aspects. And it has a lot of language to that effect that we can go through if you'd like. But ultimately, some of the feedback that we got is there is concern about this idea that we don't have a line. It's not specific. And this is in the feedback document. There was very much some concern that we use the term multiple or significant, because those terms are not, they're not hard and fast. They're vague, and they're intentionally vague. The idea being that we're trying to allow a space where the universities, the LEAs can experiment and say, it's not one size fits all. We can customize this. Everybody needs to demonstrate these things. But how they demonstrate them and how long it takes them to demonstrate them and how long it takes to learn them can vary. So that's really our feedback on that. Two other key points that I want to address before I ask for any clarifying questions you'd like to have. The other item that was quite controversial, and it would be remiss of me not to mention it, is in the original draft, it referred to having clinical experiences at the beginning, middle, and end of the school year. There was some very big concerns about that from some universities. There were other universities that felt they were already doing that. So ultimately, what we did was we looked again at the research just to clarify what is it that we're really trying to get at. And it boils down to that one of the largest concerns from the focus groups, from working teachers, is that whether you're alternatively prepared or traditionally prepared, you struggle with classroom management. And that's kind of a broad term, so when we dug into it deeper, it really became about that new teachers have a hard time establishing and implementing classroom routines and procedures. That's what their issues lie around. And so we rephrased it. Instead of just vaguely referring to times of the year, we said, look, you have to provide clinical experience where they experience creating and implementing procedures and routines in the beginning of a semester or school year. And the research represents that. The middle and end of the school year, not so much. But the beginning of a school year, beginning of a semester where they're establishing classroom routines and procedures, the research was pretty clear on that one. So that's how we modified the language there. And then the last one I wanted to mention, again from a feedback summary, was some very good feedback I thought that came from UEA. And that was in regards to, if we think of a preparation program as a district, so district, pick your choice, they are now taking on a dual role. They are both employing the educator and they are supposed to be preparing that teacher and training that educator in those skills and knowledge. And so it creates some interesting conflicts that we really hadn't considered. And so I put those questions in the feedback summary for your consideration. I am not a lawyer, so I don't know that I can answer all of them, but they certainly were worth reading, I thought. I thought that was very good feedback, that it's things we hadn't thought about. But other than that, so just so you're aware, this is a delayed implementation rule. This is intended to go into effect with the rest of the licensing rules on January 1, 2020. So this is not an immediate thing. This is something that, like I said, we've been working with universities, like Diana said, for 3-4 years on this, to be perfectly honest. And some of them are more willing to go down this path than others. But it really depends. So with that, Chair, that's my presentation, if there's any questions.
We have had, I think the whole board got at least one email regarding the assessment portion, and it's not in the feedback summary. I'm just wondering if you want to
Sure, yeah,
talk
I
about
can
that
address
quickly
that.
before.
So a related issue that will come up tomorrow in the board is the adoption of standards for a pedagogical performance assessment. And there was an email distributed to board members. There was concern about the second draft. One of the things I wanted to mention is we feel strongly that the second draft is the most appropriate. One of the biggest loopholes that we missed, quite honestly, that we missed in the first draft of those rules was that it did not create an independent evaluation. There was a loophole that essentially allowed you, whether you're a principal or you're a university, to have this, you evaluate it yourself, which is what they do. Universities do that now. They do student-teacher evaluations. That's not, that's what they do now. But ultimately, when we think of this in terms of the licensing structure that the board has, tasked us with, we're trying to make an even playing field. Everyone meets the same requirements. And so for the pedagogical performance assessment, we know that when I am a university faculty member working with one of my students, or I'm a principal working with one of my teachers, I am often, or at least it's difficult to always make that independent, verifiable decision regarding the performance of that individual. And that's why the second draft really addresses and makes clear that it needs to be an independent assessment. And so that the email that you received was very concerned about that, and I understand that. To be perfectly honest with you, I can't tell you that every single university is overjoyous about this. I can tell you that most deans are on board. They've actually been working on this since June. Whether they're just figuring this is going to happen and just doing it, or doing it willingly, I honestly couldn't speak for them. But there's 1 or 2 faculty members in different universities that have issues. And to be honest with you, that's what you're seeing, because there's a number of individual faculty members in universities that will provide feedback outside on their own, and they should. So there you go.
I thought that was specifically mentioned in here, so I apologize if I wasn't speaking
That's all
directly
right.
to the draft. I apologize.
But I'm always happy to answer.
Okay. Are there any questions about this draft? Board Member Cummins?
Okay, sorry, on line 54, I think, sorry. So this section 3, is talking about general teacher preparation, and it's requiring that it's an and for early childhood core standards. Should that be an and there?
So if you look, I believe it's up in the purpose statement up on line 14 and 15. This is what we kind of put in as a blanket statement to kind of deal with those kind of issues. And that is, the standards in this rule apply to the specific educational area and grade level for which the program is designed. So if it's a secondary program, no, they don't need to be trained in the early childhood standards. That was our assumption as we wrote this.
Can I ask?
Yes, go ahead and
So,
please.
but I believe it's repeated when you get to the early childhood. Is that correct? I think the essential elements reference.
I believe you're probably correct. So maybe it doesn't. Not that I'm seeing. Do you have a line?
No, I don't, sorry.
So So when I'm looking at the early childhood and elementary, I'm not seeing any reference to the core standards, simply a reference back up.
Okay.
So
Go ahead,
we do
Ben.
reference that section, and if you look on line 167, under the early childhood,
Yeah,
it does
that's-
incorporate that. But
Okay. Can I just ask why it just isn't in the early childhood section and why it's in the general?
I don't know that I could give you a strong argument as to why it should be one way or the other, to be perfectly honest with you. You could break it out. I think my intention was to put it at the beginning because all teachers are prepared to teach the standards. Whether I'm special ed, particularly special ed, deaf education, sometimes there are individuals that will make the claim that they don't need to teach the standards, they're using specialized instruction, and that's not the case. But that's a very poor argument, so I could see it written either way, to be honest.
Can I just keep, anyone can ask questions, interrupt me at
No,
any point and
please
ask
go.
their own questions. I've just got a list of things. So line 54, I believe, sorry, that's where I just was, right?
Yes.
Line 69-ish, where it's requiring demonstration of competency. Let's see, go back. So it's talking about clinical, school-based clinical experiences for candidates to observe, practice, and reflect, and it gives a list of things. And then it's 4 says that it ensure that they have clinical experiences with sufficient depth, breadth, and duration to ensure that they have gained the skills and knowledge, dispositions requisite so all students learn. I'm just curious what the need for 4 is, if we've already talked about significant number, scope, complexity, and we've already delineated out, is it?
So it was, the idea, again, in the writing, was that when we looked at the focus groups, they thought of it in 2 different ways. They thought about this idea of having enough clinical experience that's progressively more complex, it's in multiple classrooms, it's, that kind of first one. And then the other thing they wanted to emphasize or to make a point to, at least again in the focus groups, was that the line 66 is trying to talk about the rigor of the clinical experience. And you are probably right. That probably could be incorporated with the previous section. But I just thought of it as 2 ideas because that's the way I heard it, to be perfectly honest. So.
Go ahead.
Okay. Can I make a motion before, so I don't get lost in all my questions? Sorry, do you have something specific?
Mine's specific to
that.
Deaf and hearing part, so go
Okay.
ahead.
I've got a couple questions too, but.
I just want to also make sure we turn it over to public comment.
Yeah, okay, so should I just ask questions? And like I said, I'm willing to give the floor because I have a heap of questions. And so, do you want me to hold any motions or action until
Yes, if
after
we
all
can,
those
then we
questions are
can
asked?
ask for
Okay.
public comment. I do
So
have
I
one
can
person signed up.
Continue my list.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll come back to you. Board Member Davis, your light's been on the whole time, so I'm not sure if it's.
Mine are kind of simpler. Mine are
Go ahead.
simpler questions. First of all, on line 44, you talk about the essential elements, which is capitalized, so it must be something, but it's not in the definitions. I think it should be, is what I'm saying. Tell us what.
So just so you're aware, the essential elements are part of the special education rule book that's incorporated by reference, and we could certainly either reference it there or put it in the definitions.
I
We
just
can
think
absolutely do that.
it'd be, a normal person reading this, and I know it's
Yep.
for this rule is really not for just an average person, but still, to have a capitalized phrase like that doesn't have any context is.
We can certainly do
Not
that.
helpful, so I'd suggest that.
Mhm.
The other question, that again, just sort of a tedious note, on line 106, I didn't think you were supposed to use EG in rule writing.
Are you looking at the current draft?
Yeah, I'm not
She's looking at
seeing.
draft 1.
Line
We were on-
106, no, I'm in draft 2.
It's not on 9.
I don't-
Line 106, it
On line-
says draft 2.
I think my original draft had something like that, but we took it out in the.
Well, I've got draft 2, January 8th, so.
She printed up the one that we replaced, that had the
Oh,
numbering
you
off.
might have printed this right before we.
But have no idea you
Because
replaced it?
the last line number, I didn't see it like that either.
Okay, well, just
This
do
is not a
something about that,
specific-
EG.
Yes, absolutely. I will do so.
Sorry, go ahead, I'm going to turn
I
it back
got
to
one more, just.
Can I just interrupt with a
Oh, sorry.
specific question to what we're concerned with? Because all my lines are off.
Oh, wait.
So was there a
No, it's
different
there.
draft that was put up
118.
at some point? Because all of my
I
line
think you have the one from
references,
yesterday.
You have the same one
I read it today.
Oh,
I-
And that's
I
what,
did
This
too.
was
Yeah.
posted about noon today.
I read it before, I got
because
it.
I'm struggling, because all my line
Are
references
different.
that I wrote down are all way off, and so I'm having a hard time.
Do we need to print off the previous version to make it easier?
Which draft
We can
are
certainly
you-
do that.
are
I don't
you
know what
working
draft.
from, Travis?
I'm working from the one that's currently on
Draft
board
two.
docs.
Draft 2, and I probably gave you draft 1.
This is draft one, but it is,
There was another draft too.
there was
The line
another
number was
draft
off.
something.
Does somebody else want a hard copy? I would print a hard copy.
I guess I would,
She's right,
if they're
though,
that
on
far
118.
off.
Let me-
Because I'm like totally
I think
floundering.
we fixed
Sorry.
that once and it's not that.
it's important that we're all on the same draft.
Absolutely.
Literally on the same page, right?
I will print that.
I like, I love those cliches when they're literal.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I just had one more question that's related to what you were just talking about, and because the emails I received, which the only place I could even generally trace them back to was the comments were about this rule, were about this pedagogical assessment, that I can't find anywhere in this rule.
The pedagogical assessment is actually required in R277301. And last month, the board took, or the committee passed
coming out tomorrow.
so the rule directed the superintendent to create standards for such an assessment.
Okay.
And so part of the committee report tomorrow will be that it passed out of the committee last month and for.
But
consideration.
somehow these people who were sending me emails had drafts of different versions of the standards.
So the standards were first presented to law and licensing in November. The committee directed staff to go back to make some changes, and then it was brought back in December, and that was the version that you would then see. So that's why there's a draft 1 and a draft 2 of those standards. I don't think there's anything more than a draft 1 or 2.
I thought there were 3 and 4.
Is there? Oh, geez, I'd have to look.
I'm just saying, I was completely unable to respond to these individuals and had never heard of this, so where should we have been able to see this, the standards for the assessment? Were
So-
they in 301?
No, the rule just directed the superintendent to create them. So if you look at board docs for tomorrow's meeting, under law and licensing, you'll see a report out on those standards,
Which comes from the superintendent?
meaning staff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's not, and so will it, and it will be
It won't be
in-
incorporated in rule, it will simply be approved by the board.
Okay. Okay, wow.
Since
All right.
we're talking about that, I have another question.
All right,
Shauna.
so that's good, that's all I
So
have.
there's another rule, though, that says we have to do that assessment that was already passed.
That was 301.
Right.
But the standards will be created by the
Correct.
superintendent?
And it actually gave us a deadline, and because the committee sent it back, we actually missed our own deadline. So that's why it's
That
coming
never
back tomorrow.
happens.
No, never, ever.
Okay. So I
Did you have
guess-
any more? Because I think.
No, I don't, thank you.
Board Member Davis was waiting.
I don't, and she was.
Doesn't require patience. I'm not sure if she turned that over to me or not, but I guess I'll
She
go
did.
forward. Did she?
Absolutely.
I mean, I heard her say my name, but.
Yeah.
So I have a question about this specifically, and then the piece about the School for the Deaf and Blind, but, so I'm just getting a little background. So this was proposed legislatively, the performance assessment. Did that pass, and is that what initiated the rule that we passed here that now we have to do? So it's not an option of whether there's going to be a performance assessment or not, that's done, is that right?
Well, you can always bring
Technically,
something
nothing's ever
back.
done,
Right,
right.
you can always bring something back.
There is no statutory requirement of it. It's only a board rule requirement.
Okay, so is it possible to get a little background? It didn't pass through the legislature. What was the background of this committee?
I wasn't on.
Would you like me to
Yes.
explain? Let's see how well I can do this. So this,
Oh, I'm really sorry. I need to state, I work for a university teacher preparation program. And I talked to Brian Quisenberry. Sorry, I've learned about 100 names. I'm trying to remember everybody. So I said, do I need to recuse myself from this whole thing? And he said, you need to state that you are involved in this. So I'm making it, stating it. Sorry, now go ahead. I was afraid
So,
I wouldn't cover myself.
I'm going to try to give you a lot of history very quickly. So if I gloss over something that you really wanted details on, please tell me. So originally, where did this all start? It starts in the fall of 2016, when the APT license is created by the board, and then the board decides to create a licensing task force to redesign licensing. As part of that work, the board task force looked at, should there be, what is the gateway? So the new licensing system, for anyone that's not familiar, which may be everyone, I don't know. So the new licensing system involves an associate license and a professional license. An associate license is someone who's being prepared to be a teacher, and a professional license is someone who has demonstrated that they have the skills and knowledge necessary. And ultimately, preparation is what's between those two things. And so after the board committee finished their work, made the recommendations to the board, then we crafted into that original rule, R277301, the requirement that the gateway, one of the gateways, from an associate to a professional license would be a pedagogical performance assessment, and that's where that requirement comes from. So it does honestly date back to the very beginning of the board task force. And let's just say it's always been a point of contention about what it is. I mean, originally we didn't know if we were going to just adopt one as a state, like some states do, or we ended up saying, well, we'll adopt standards, and then if something meets the standard, great. If you want to make something that meets the standard, great. But those that does cost money to do that, so it's not always feasible on a short-term basis. So, but ultimately, it was really seen as the independent third-party evaluation to verify that these people are ready to be given a statewide license, not a license that's only good in a district, but this one can go anywhere in the state.
A professional
license.
Not an associate.
Yes, correct. Did that answer? I hope so.
I think so.
If not, you're always welcome to call me on my phone, too. I'm happy to.
My question about the School for the Deaf and Blind is, I'm looking at, and now I don't know if I even have the right draft.
You have the one online, so yours is the one.
So, okay, I'm looking at lines,
If you read it, I'll know where it is.
okay, 301, it's under the section of 301. And so this says, approval, let's see, operated or partnered with a Utah Institute of Higher Education or the Utah State Board of Education. So there's no LEA there. So the Utah School for the Deaf and Blind is not an LEA that's approved to coach and teach their own teachers into licensing. Am I understanding that correctly?
So, as part of the rule development, I think you are, though it could be argued because the state board oversees USDB. But anyway, the issue was, it was pointed out when 301 was passed that, and it's in 301, that special education licensing must be university-based. And so this was created to say, well, we want it university-based or with the state board. So we just transferred that requirement. We assumed that's what the board would want. Maybe you don't. But from anything that was special education related, we embedded that requirement like it was in 301. Doesn't mean it has to be there, but that's what's there.
Okay, so I have one more question about this, but what was the impetus for the special education being university-based as opposed to having the same LEA option?
So I can only speak to my remembrance, not necessarily the intention of board members, but is my recollection that there was concern regarding special education due to the vulnerable and high risks issues that can, it's a population that needs protected, and it was felt that the rigor and the preparation to be a special ed teacher needed to be with a university, not something that a district designed themselves. Honestly, that's what I believe it boiled down to. But that's just my recollection.
Interesting. Thank you. My question about the in light of the parent comments that we heard this morning in our meeting, I'm reading this on lines 308 for deaf education preparation programs. It says, can be focused on one or more of the following areas. And then it goes through using both listening and spoken language strategies and American Sign Language, using listening and spoken language strategies only, or using American Sign Language and English. And I'm trying to remember how English literacy differs from LSL. But so am I understanding this correctly, that a teacher can come out prepared with strategies only for LSL, or only for a combination, or only for ASL?
Yes.
And be certified as a teacher of?
Right, and to clarify, so the current rule regarding deaf education, because remember, this is a conglomeration of a number of different rules, it basically indicates two specializations, and we think of them in terms of endorsement. So when you get your deaf education license, you can get one of two endorsements, ASL or LSL, because they're a primary focus of a type of pedagogical instruction. What we were missing, and this was feedback from USDB themselves, was that there's an early childhood area where you have to know both so that you can help with parent choice and helping them find what's best for them. And so that's why we added that. But that's what those are. You can think
So
of those
three
like
choices.
the three choices, the three endorsements that would attach to such a license,
Okay.
essentially.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Sorry, I apologize. Go ahead.
Okay.
Without my mic on.
I think I found all my line issues. but-
Okay.
Okay.
I apologize for that.
No, that's okay. Okay, so line 89. Line 89 is references, so it's talking about 87, skills in implementing personalized learning practices that consider the whole child, including trauma, restorative practices. And so this seems to be, the first line seems to be broad, and then it gets super narrow with the two lines that support it. So I'm just curious why it was written in that way.
This has been a journey for me because these are not my area of expertise. But we may need to bring these things back to you with some people more well-versed than I. But essentially, from the focus groups, the term that was used was trauma-informed instructional practices. And in the feedback that came in from the universities, there were many that, like you, said that's very specific. It needs to be more broad. So this language and encouraging those was intended as a compromise between the two. But to be honest, I'm not the perfect person to say if those should be detailed out specifically or not. 87 and 88 was what I was trying to get at, but there were people that really felt that those specific trauma-informed practices, restorative instructional practices were valid enough and important enough to include, but I'm definitely not the expert in that area.
And then, so can I just keep going? Is that okay? And so, because on line 103, it says, is talking about knowledge and skills designed to meet the needs of diverse student populations in a general education classroom, including. So is that specific to special ed students, or does that incorporate that same idea of personalized learning?
I think So I think so 103, the important lines are the next four sections that are incorporating. So it's talking about being responsive, multiple ways of demonstrating knowledge, student diversity and backgrounds and needs, and then English language learners. So it calls them out a little bit more specifically as far as the types of students, but yeah, I see your point. There's some overlap there.
Could we combine those two sections or those two letters?
I could probably figure out a way to do it, yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
I'm just kidding. Stop me when you want me to stop. Line
You don't
one-
need to ask me between each
Okay.
one. You
Okay.
have the floor until someone else.
Okay. Line 151. So these are requirements that they're having these experiences, if I'm understanding this, right? They're having these experiences collaborating with grade level, subject, and cross-curricular teams too. line 151 is I, implementing common formative assessments. And I'm just curious why that is in there as a specific thing where it's required that they have a formative assessment that's the same as the other teachers that are teaching third grade.
I think it was entered there in terms of, in general practice, in most cases, I guess maybe I shouldn't say all cases, but in most cases, a professional learning computer or a PLC where you're meeting as one of these teams, whether it's grade level, subject, whatever it is, that's what they talk about. They talk about planning our instruction, modifying it, how can we do this better, and then having common formative assessments so that they have better comparative data. It was my understanding that that's major practice. Maybe it's not. Maybe I'm mistaken. But that's why.
It is, it's PO, yeah.
So to require an experience to have a very specific PLC format, is that what we want? Do we want to go that far into it where we say, here's what a PLC looks like across the state, therefore it should have all of these common elements in a PLC, where a PLC may not always mean that they're assessing their students with a common formative assessment. They may be using common other assessments, but are they using common assessments across the board?
That's a valid point. And I think that when I was writing it, I was trying to say PLC without saying PLC. So I was just writing what I thought they did. But I don't think but I think the core of the idea is to require them to participate in a PLC for a valid instructional purpose. And maybe we can take off those 3 lines and reword that.
Okay. Okay.
I'm gonna have to come back to this recording to remember all this.
Okay. Is that okay? I mean, I'm just one board member with
Well, I
questions.
think
so-
no one else is asking questions, so we can continue to do this, or we could bring this one back if there's so many things that we need to go through, because it's,
Okay.
I mean, that's just one, I'm just looking at time. We're not going to be able to finish everything, because I guess every item's pretty heavy.
Okay.
So
tell me what you want me to do.
do you have a lot more still?
Not a ton, just a couple more. But I guess the
You
question
lifted up a
is-
couple pages.
I skipped one.
Go ahead.
So you want me to keep going?
Right, I do want to turn it over to public comment, but I'm thinking where we're going is we're going to need to ask him to incorporate things in another draft if there's significant changes you want to see. And then I also do want to turn the time over to public comment. But sorry, I guess we're going to let Board Member Lear interrupt you really quick.
Just to give you a chance to find your place and that kind of stuff, but.
Put your mic towards you.
Cindy brought this up, but then I looked at it again, and I think it's.
Can you put your mic towards you, just for our public?
Yes, no, I'm sorry. Cindy brought this up, but I think it's a good point, and I looked at it again. On line 90, this is in the right draft now that we're looking at, where you talk about restorative instructional practices. I think you mean restorative justice, and it doesn't really quite make sense then if you say in restorative justice instructional practices.
So we do have a specialist that I was emailing with just before this meeting regarding those types of practices, and they would be a better person to answer those questions. So if we have some kind of that language in a draft, we come back, we'll make sure that individual is here
phrase.
to, absolutely.
And my druthers would be, just again, if you're looking at it again, that it's not jargony, and 5 years from now,
Absolutely.
we'll say, oh, that was in
Yep.
the early, that was 2018 when they were doing that restorative justice stuff,
Got it.
you know?
Absolutely.
That you can just explain what you mean. Thanks.
Board Member Cummins, do you think that you'd be done in like 5 minutes?
Yes.
Okay.
I will speak quickly.
I'm going to skip one question. So on line, 383, it requires candidates to have 6 years of documented related occupational experience in order to be a candidate in the preparation program for a CTE program. Is that correct?
So one thing to bear in mind, the last section that you're referring to is referring to CTE areas in which they do not have a bachelor's degree. Any CTE area where a bachelor's degree required would fall under secondary. This is just things like automotive technician, welding, trade skills. That's why that requirement is there.
Is that explicit somewhere?
That the lines 377 to 382 are meant to be explicit for that.
But I think she means, is that requirement coming from somewhere else, or how'd you
So-
come to that?
It's
Can it be
from the current board rules, so
Okay.
we just,
So can I ask a specific question?
Uh-huh.
So for example, family and consumer sciences, I think there's a bachelor's degree in home ec. Is that correct? And so I could get a secondary home ec degree, but would that follow under family and
So-
consumer sciences?
the way this is worded was intended to include things such as chef. Like, there's an endorsement regarding culinary arts that may not involve a special ed. But you are correct that family and consumer sciences itself, in general, like facts general, is a degree. So maybe we do need to be more specific in that. My concern with that is CTE areas and endorsements, particularly in skilled and technical, change rapidly. That would be my only concern.
So maybe just some language that says in areas where a bachelor's degree is not.
Sure.
You know, so you're differentiating it from those areas where I can go get a bachelor's degree in home ec and become a teacher and teach home ec,
I'll work with
right?
Talia to get some language for that, yeah.
Without having to say I have to have 6 years of experience sewing. Yes, correct.
That's the intention in
Yes.
lieu, yeah. Yep.
But if it's stated somewhere at the top of the area, because it made it sound like, so it might already be stated.
I don't think it's, I think what she's talking about isn't quite there yet, but I
Okay.
think we can do it. I think we can do it. Yeah.
Okay. And then just my last question was just a follow-up on what Board Member Davis was talking about, where we had those 3 areas of focus for the ASL, LSL, or what. And so is it, does the program make known that they have a focus in specific areas? Because under there, it says, it just says they have these. Do they make known that we are a blah, blah, blah school? We are,
They should. The intention of this is to mirror the special ed part, where the special ed says mild, moderate, severe, and those different ones. But rather than naming the endorsements, we just put in this language to be the general idea. But it might be a good idea for us to have Assistant Superintendent, I don't know her last name, Michelle? No, Michelle from USDB. Tanner, thank you, to be with us next month to address those questions better than I.
Board Member Davis, can you turn your mic on?
Yeah, just because it's a little confusing, because it does separate them out at the top, but then on like 330, then it says they have to have basic fluency in the use of American Sign Language, whereas up above, it seems to give the illusion of a freedom that you can just, you can do an LSL program. So just, I guess if she could clarify that, that'd be great.
I think I could respond to that one, but essentially, you'll notice in the rule, if you look carefully, that there's this basic level, that the expectation is for all deaf education teachers to have a basic level. And then if you look at the one a little further down that talks about if you're specializing in ASL, you have to meet a specific level of proficiency on an exam, which would be a much higher level of proficiency. That's how she would explain it, but it's certainly up to you.
Yeah, I'm just wondering how much they're going to separate out, because like right now, they don't even want a substitute teacher that's a signer in their LSL class. It's just
Let's just say I try to avoid all those arguments.
Yeah, I'm just trying to wrap my head around
Absolutely.
it, but I'm done.
Thank you. Board Member Lear?
One last comment. Did it strike you, I mean, the supreme irony of this, that the very detailed requirements for a person in a licensing program, or you can just walk into a school and get a job?
What are you referring to?
I'm talking about LEA specific more. I mean, I almost want to say, reduce this down to 3 pages so that there's some comparability.
So in my mind, the LEA-specific license is intended as a last-ditch release valve.
And that's all in all of our minds, but it doesn't
And
say
exactly.
that on
But
paper.
if that's changed, we've talked about this before, that if that doesn't turn out that way, we can take action to do that. My concern is, what you described to me feels like lowering the bar for the professional license that goes to any district. And that LEA-specific The onus is not on the board. The Board of Education is going to monitor them for UPAC, but that's pretty much it. The LEA has their own requirements for that. But this license is one that Davis School District, Spectrum Academy, any LEA can say this person has met the standard, and I think that needs to be an important standard to set, in my opinion.
And it just, again, just for the comment and for the record, I think it feels like a huge chasm of difference without, this is so prescriptive and so exacting and so arduous that I kind of wish there was a little more middle ground. I wish there was a little more required for the teacher just walking in and getting the job because they need a person versus the preparation program, preparing a, I wish there was a difference in salaries. I wish there were a difference in it just feels so counterintuitive. Thanks.
Okay, I'm going to turn the time over to public comment. Will you stay there in case there's any questions? I'll turn this seat into public comment. If that, or over there.
We got one right here.
I have Vincent Bates is signed up for public comment, and if anyone else would like to speak, please. Okay, Terry, after. Please let me know. Okay, and I don't. Okay, thank you.
Right there.
Right here. Please introduce yourself, and if you represent someone, who you represent.
Vincent Bates. I'm an associate professor of teacher education at Weber State University. I'm also director of the Weber Snow Collaborative Music Licensure Program. I like this rule overall, and I congratulate the board on promoting high standards for educators. However, I do believe that these standards will be seriously undermined by the pedagogical performance assessment standards. I know that's not part of the rule, but since these have been discussed in conjunction with this rule this evening, could I have just 1 minute to explain why?
Yes, please.
In my reading of the performance assessment standards, they'll require a high-stakes commercial standardized assessment as the primary deciding factor in licensure. The two most likely vendors for this assessment are Pearson, EdTPA, and ETS with their PPAT. In both assessments, the actual teaching portion is a 15-minute video scored by an independent observer. We have students that can write great lessons and can reflect very eloquently on their work. But when they get in the classroom, they can't manage a class. They can't teach. So that's the justification for a performance assessment in my mind. And a 15-minute video simply doesn't cut it. We currently evaluate our elementary teachers in person 10 times over 3 semesters, and our secondary teachers 7 times over 2 semesters. Now, a standardized test might be a good idea as part of a bigger picture, but certainly not as a deciding factor. For example, at UVU, they use the EdTPA, but I believe that's part of a larger process. Standing alone, it doesn't have the depth or authenticity of multiple in-text observations. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. So you didn't have a question unless you wanted to ask one. So we'll go ahead and turn the time over to Terry. Thank you for coming and giving public comment. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Terry Shoemaker with Utah School Superintendents and School Boards Association. I don't want to spend a lot of time on the rule. There's a lot here. This thing is gigantic, as was expressed. And when we had a discussion with some superintendents and with Travis recently, it was clearly on the minds of the superintendents how big the changes are. We're so used to a student teaching program. We're so used to having a certain amount of time with teachers in certain ways as part of their preparation program. And so we're going to have to evolve, I believe, into this over some time. But the principles discussed here, none of them felt like the principles discussed here are things that aren't important. So, getting at a couple of things, there's some things that are very specific. I think, things about like, what do we do with certain instructional methods, or which teacher instructional testing plan that works on, an observation plan like EdTPA. Those things can be debated over time, but this is really changing the needle versus what we've done all the years I've been in education, which is nearly 40 now. So it is significant. And as you contemplate the elements of what this rule means, you should take the time to make sure that it's doing exactly what is intended here, and that is to move the needle to make sure that better instruction occurs in classrooms, that our teachers are actually helping our kids become more proficient in what it is that they're learning. That's why we're doing this. I think this contains much of what is right there. I would just urge you to continue to study it carefully. We're going to study it carefully and continue to provide feedback. There's been a great effort to move this along over time. And now we're at the point of trying to make decisions about a significant change involving the universities and what occurs in the schools themselves. We're going to need some time to figure out how to do that exceptionally well. That was much of the conversation that we had with superintendents just a day or two ago. It wasn't we don't like this, it was how do we do this versus what we've been doing. And we're going to need some time to make that work out. The implementation date, as I understand it, is 2020. So we have some time to work on it. We also have some time, because it's 2020, to begin to not begin, but to modify this if it is necessary as it moves forward. But in terms of what it's going to do for children, we generally feel this is moving in the right direction.
Thank you. Tracy?
Tracy Watson, Utah Education Association. First, I do want to compliment Travis on record, right? It's an amazing feat, Travis and others, to take on a concept and write a rule about something we haven't done before. So where normally we're used to changing rules, modifying rules, adopting rules, but really like this new concept like Terry was talking about. So I just want to point out some questions at this point, some concerns, some places in the rule that may need some clarification. And we come at this from a little bit different perspective because I'm brought into things when things go wrong, right? Like so a teacher that doesn't certify, a teacher that isn't able to license in one of or the other program. Okay, so I'm concerned about this new role that the employer as preparer. That's where we're most concerned. Now, unfortunately, I'm working off draft 1, dated January 4th, because we have to spend time on this when we can, and I didn't know that there was a new draft today. But I just have a couple of comments. And some of these have been discussed in one version or another. So my first comment happens sort of when we talk about the general teacher preparation in section 3, and sort of beginning on what would be subparagraph 3. It talks about practice skills and reflect on teaching that occur in multiple schools and classrooms. So if the LEA is the preparer, how does the candidate get this experience in multiple schools and classrooms? What if they're assigned to a classroom or a school, right? So I'm a little concerned about that specificity. And if we move them around, are they really getting the right experience? Because as you know, like if we're talking classroom management or skills, I mean, children get to know the teacher over time. And so if we're then, in order to meet this requirement, moving the teacher to another classroom where they're sort of starting anew, that may not give the teacher the best experience. And then it also says, include creating and consistently implementing classroom procedures and routines in the beginning of the semester or the school year, and Travis had just addressed that in terms of instead of beginning, middle, and end, but we're still a little uncomfortable with that. Continuing to subsection 4, it puts the burden on the LEA to ensure, that's a liability word. Ensure that candidates have clinical experiences with sufficient depth, breadth, and duration. How are we going to measure that? And how are we going to measure that consistently? So if the candidate isn't successful, there's going to be an argument that the preparer did not provide sufficient depth, breadth, and duration. And so I would love it if we could look at that or discuss that further and see if we couldn't come up with something else. Moving to the end of subsection 3, the last little bit, subparagraphs 7 and 8. On my version, it's around line 155. So in sub 7, evaluation was changed to consideration. So include consideration of a candidate's dispositions and suitability for teaching. As a lawyer, I'm concerned about how one measures a disposition and suitability for teaching. Those are pretty subjective. It's going to be hard to set up objective, valid, reliable criteria to measure a disposition. Some would argue they don't like my disposition. I know my disposition is not suitable for teaching. But we don't have to have an objective, valid, and reliable tool for that. You just have to know me. And then it talks about including plans for candidate remediation, and I'm just kind of curious, because we have that for provisionals, is this the same thing as a provisional educator? Because we still use provisional and career employee in statute, and so how will this measure up with other educators that have provisional status? And I just think we have to look at that if we're expanding the LEA's responsibilities to include preparer. I think I only have 2 more. In subsection 5, which is the secondary education, I believe, the last couple of lines, subsection 2D, consulting with a school counselor regarding the emotional well-being of students and referring the students to a school counselor when necessary. We think that should be a requirement for all the teacher sections, right? Because, I mean, the emotional well-being of students is important at every level, and knowing when, I mean, an elementary student might need counseling at one level, where a junior high or a high school student would also need to know when to refer to the school counselor. And that's where, I mean, Ben can talk about a lot of boundary violations come in, right? And if they're a little, if they're a little kid, can I handle this, or should it go to a counselor? The last comment. That was my last comment. So thank you very much.
Thank you. If the board members on the committee members would work with, is Travis, oh, we have one more, I apologize. No, please. I thought you were just pointing at Trace. I thought you were just helping Tracy out because I couldn't see her.
Yeah, well, I was doing that also. Rita Hagren with American Federation of Teachers, Utah. Again, I'm going to reiterate what Tracy said, that Travis has done phenomenal work, and he should be knighted and canonized in the whole bit.
We'll have a
for what he's
crown.
done with this. Okay, now that I've made him uncomfortable. I see a lot of this stuff at work here, and it is a major shift in what we're doing by talking about preparing teachers. I want to talk about a couple of the ones that, and I did send some feedback to Travis, but I think about more things when I work collaboratively, listening to what everyone's saying. Talking about what Tracy was just talking about also on line 58, where it says, include school-based clinical experiences, so there's plural there, for a candidate to observe, practice skills, and reflect on teaching that, and then you have A through E. When I went through the program back in the late 70s, early 80s, we went out during my sophomore year and spent a week in a classroom. And so I perceived that when I was reading this as happening throughout the preparation program, not just the final student teaching situation. And I know you can weed a lot of people out when you do that. And you spend 1 week in a junior high and it's like, okay, I don't want to do this, or yes, I love this the most. I would suggest taking line 64, the E, and moving that into section 4, because that's talking about more of the clinical experiences. To me, that's more of the student teaching section. And that's when you would actually implement the classroom procedures at the beginning or at the semester. And that's how it resonated in my head. I'm sorry.
64.
That's 64, yeah, 64. Just take that section. Yeah, just down to the next paragraph section. And then I want to speak a little bit about, the trauma-informed instructional practices and restorative instructional practices. I taught math for 33 years. I minored in math. I taught it at the high school level. And my pedagogy for teaching math was, I had a geometry teacher that had surveys of geometries and taught everything but except for Euclidean plane geometry, which is what we taught in the high schools. So I did all this geometry that I would never teach. And I was never taught a teaching method, okay? Let alone, how I would deal with the trauma-informed instruction. I don't have those skills. I never went through that program. I was a good teacher. I was a really good teacher. But when I spent 1 year in a junior high after I retired, they sucked me back in, and I was dealing with my whole classroom full of traumatized students, multi-generational poverty, and then the restorative practices. I barely made it through 1 year, and it was because I did not have those skills. And I know that the students that are coming out now to teach, they're being prepared in these areas. They are very specific. So when it says restorative instructional practices, that is what it means. It's not restorative justice instructional practices. Okay, it's really where it's at, the restorative part. Okay.
Can you help Travis know how to explain that more?
Yes.
We'll have expertise
Yes.
for you, absolutely.
But that, making that specifically specified in the requirements for them to teach, it will help them survive their first 3 years of teaching and know how to do it. So, thank you.
Thank you. Was there anyone else, so I don't forget? Go ahead, Superintendent.
Cindy Dixon, State Superintendent. I just want to make a quick general statement. I have loved the discussion and a lot of the specific questions that you've had to try and get this right. I just want to talk about the board's role in teacher preparation and commend Travis and the work that they've done in really reaching out to focus groups and trying to get broad-based input. I've been here long enough that I've seen the iterations of the board's role in teacher preparation. And when I first came into licensing, we had a little bit of input into teacher preparation, and there was so much differentiation amongst programs. And we had conversations with the board about it, and at that time there was an accreditation process in place, and that board made the determination to just back off and say, let's let accreditation take care of it, because the board had a process and then there was accreditation, and the dean said, we feel like there's duplicity in effort and it's too overwhelming for us, so can we do one or the other? And the board said, well, all right, we'll just accept accreditation. What we found in that process is that the board then lost their role, and if you saw something happening or you wanted to strengthen the teaching workforce, which as related to licensing, you lost that ability to do so. So then the board had another iteration, and that was, do we really care about accreditation? Is it bean counting? And universities said, I'm not sure we care about it that much, when at one time they really, really did. So now you're in this space where one of your goals is ensuring that each student has an effective teacher and leader. And you really don't have much in rule to try and provide policy leverage to make that happen. And teacher preparation is a really profound and strong way for you to have a role. And we are a state that does a lot less in that area than other states. I mean, there are many states where within the state agency, under the board's direction, they have an entire section with a lot of people who work on teacher preparation and monitoring programs and promoting or giving the board advice about what to do with a program, putting it on remediation or amping it up, like they're really specific about their recommendations. We're lucky in that we have 10 programs, unlike some of these states, even that are our same size, they have 41 programs. Can you imagine trying to manage all of those? So we're really unique and lucky in that we have 10 preparation programs. We're at the table with those deans every month. They have a dean's council. They work together. It's really unheard of. So we have this great, unique situation, and I think that we have to get this right. So I love listening to your conversation and all the great questions that are being asked. But I commend you for this consideration and would say to you that I believe the board does have a role in teacher preparation. So if you stray too far and try to get too general and take a lot of stuff out, then you might lose what leverage you have to help prepare effective teachers in a more consistent manner. I think you've got some really a good foundation, a lot of work to do, and there's this continuum of specificity to generalization that I think you can play with and will be okay, but I just appreciate you considering your role in teacher preparation and how important that is. Thanks.
Thank you, Superintendent. Board Member Davis, did you have a comment?
I'm not sure which one of you it's for, or who's going to answer this, but, this in general really seems based on best practices to me, though huge. Like, I could pick out several lines in here. I'm thinking, there could be 50 pages on that sucker right there on that one line. So how that's all going to pan out, I'm not sure. But my question is, we're taught in education to have a assessment or rubric, if you will, with objective criteria for subjective expectations. Does this dovetail with what we are using with performance assessments for teachers across the board, or is this going to be only expected of people who are just starting in the teaching profession, and how do those work together, if at all?
Yeah. Yeah, that's an awesome question. I think we'll probably have the same answer. I'll let Travis answer.
Okay. I think the first thing to be aware of that this is, because this question was brought to my attention again today, that are we asking all teachers to do this or every single time? There's a section in the other rule that talks about that if you already have an instructional professional license, so secondary, elementary, then you have met the performance assessment requirement for any other instructional license area. So you might have other requirements, but you wouldn't have to go through this performance assessment again. And it was really, the intention is, if you look at the wording of that, again, that 301, which I can email you, it talks about that here, there's a line in the sand on January 1, 2020, and things change for those people coming in. And everybody else we're protecting. So if I'm APT or ARL, I get a choice. I can either do the new one or I can finish my old one, and so we don't want to change requirements on people, if that makes sense. And it is something that once you've demonstrated you can do it, then we know you can do it, and that's why we don't have level 2. We're not going to have level 1, level 2, level 3. It's just, you're professional, you got it, you're done.
But if you're talking about teacher evaluation, I think there's this really important thread. That's why I loved your question. You have passed off the effective teacher standards, Utah effective teaching standards, I think. And within those standards are used in preparation. This is based on those standards. Teacher professional development, teacher evaluation systems are all based on those standards. So that's the seamless part. And I think it's often debated around validity and reliability. What is the valid part? What is the reliable part? Well, the valid part is that continuous thread through all of them. The reliable part is how they're used over time. But the validity can land on those effective teacher standards that are based on research and are in preparation.
So each of these sort of subjective lines will have an objective criteria, so a person knows they truly are effective at having trauma-informed instructional practice. I mean, you know what I mean?
will that be provided?
Yeah, so I think the rubric is in the standards themselves right now, but it would
Because these are
depend.
standards- This is difficult to answer because these standards here are for the program. This is what so we won't.
For the
know-
LEA, right?
For the
No,
university.
this is for the university.
Or or an LEA, whoever's preparing the
yeah.
teacher is going to have to demonstrate these things. And for the purposes of this rule, if we find things lacking, we're not labeling teachers or taking away licenses. What we're doing is fixing the program. So we're not policing that individual, we're policing the program itself. And that's the difference between, right now, ARL has 1,000 people in it that we're trying to track individually versus let's have 40 school districts that we're tracking, you know.
We need to
Yes.
move off
Sorry.
to another agenda item.
Thank
So
you.
if committee members have specific recommendations for drafts, please, is it Travis that's doing this draft?
Me or Ben?
Travis.
Okay, Travis or Ben, their contact information if you need it. It should be in board docs. If not, we can make sure to get that to you. And so if you'll work with board members before the next meeting, that would be great. Thank you. We are hard stopping at 9 o'clock. So we are not going to finish everything unless we are very speedy. It's fine if we don't. So I don't want to move through something just to get through it. So we're moving to 6.5, which is an external data request. And if Whitney's here still, please come up to the table.
Good evening.
Thank you. Go ahead.
So we have two external data requests. One is for a researcher at NYU to use the data as one of the health indicators. They look at a certain threshold of population of cities across the United States, and this is one of many indicators that they use, and they're requesting aggregate level, city level data that's disaggregated by what you see here. It's on graduation rates.
Okay, is there any questions for this one? I have a question that's general for both of them. Are these new contracts, new requests, or have they already had? Are these both new requests?
These are both new requests. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so this is just aggregate level as well. Okay, so I don't see any questions. So go ahead and go to the next one.
So the next one is just a count. I talked to Leah Voorhees about this, who's in Lizard. Well, she's not here anymore. This is just for a total student enrollment. That's really high level. That's for the entire state. Total student enrollment that is identified as having being in special education, and then those having autism spectrum disorder by county or district. So these are counts, they aren't percentages. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, sorry, I thought I saw a hand. Okay, so I'm looking for a motion. If anyone, Board Member Cummins?
I move that we accept the data requests for Allegra Wilson, NYU School of Medicine, and Kelly Lewis, University of Massachusetts Lowell.
So the motion on the table is to accept the external data request for Allegra Wilson at NYU and Kelly Lewis at University of Massachusetts. To recommend the board accept the data request. Any discussion to the motion? Seeing none, all in favor? Aye. Any opposed? That passes unanimously. Thank you.
Thanks.
We got one thing voted on. Good job. Okay, 6.6, R277100. This is the definitions. And we'll turn the time over. Are you doing this, Ben?
Yeah. And then
And
Assistant
Natalie.
Superintendent Grange, if she wants to join us up here. So R277100 is our definitions rule. This applies to all board rules. And so the terms that we've added in this go-around are meant to assist with the other rule that we are planning to discuss tonight, R27743, as well as also to provide some consistency in a number of terms that are used throughout board rule that I think Natalie, our Assistant Superintendent Grange, can address.
You said R2777483?
Yes, that's the other rule we're planning to discuss tonight.
Where?
6.7?
Mine says 497.
They didn't change we changed the number
Okay,
of the
just
rule.
wanted to make sure.
It's
'cause I'm
correct
like,
on
that is
board
not
docs.
on
I
my agenda.
apologize.
Okay, go ahead.
But I think there was a feeling that the terms that we've added here are used frequently throughout board rule, and there would be good to have some consistent definitions for some of these terms in the rule. Natalie, do you want to add anything, or do we just want to take questions on these definitions?
Natalie Grange, Assistant Superintendent of Financial Operations. As it pertains to the items that were added in 100, Section 2, it was my understanding, and it was communicated to me, that I think it might have been this committee, or maybe the other one, not finance, that had a substantial conversation about the alternative school definition and the comprehensive dropout programs. Those discussions were had as they pertain to establishing standards for the state report card, SRC, that was just issued. And so these were previously living in the guidance document or the technical manual, and some of them will be, as we're matching the school level expenditures data that will be added to the school report card, which is the subject of the next rule. We felt that since it was applying to multiple locations, it was best to put them in this area. So all of the rules all of the definitions added: the alternative school, the comprehensive dropout program, ESSA, and then the definitions of school below are all things that become important to define. Some of these areas are just practice, things that we've been doing for quite a while. We wanted to make sure as we move forward with clarification that we're using the same definitions consistently across assessments, finance, data, all those areas, because it seemed like everyone had just a little bit of a different spin on those. So.
Okay, I'll turn the time over to Board Member Cummins and then Lear.
My only question is in regard to the definition of school. And because in the draft that is going to the full board tomorrow, we've defined home school. And so I'm just curious if the idea of school is going to conflict with that.
I don't think so, because homeschool is a complete phrase. It's not necessarily incorporating this definition of school into it. It's just, I think it's for homeschool student, isn't it?
What line is that?
So it's not, I don't think it shows up on this draft because it's in the one that
We've
has-
incorporated it in this draft as having been, assuming that the board will approve that tomorrow. So on line 68, you'll see homeschool student. I think that's what was added. That's what's being added by the board's vote tomorrow, assuming that it passes. But all that stuff that's on the board's agenda tomorrow is in here presupposing that it passes. If it doesn't pass, we would take that out before it comes to the board next month.
I guess, but it still doesn't quite answer my question because we're still using the word school and we're trying to define the word school, which is very different for a homeschool student, which we tried to just pull from code for that particular definition. And then if we're going to talk about school, then anyways, I'm just a little concerned about.
It seems like you could say public school.
Well, I think the problem with that is we don't refer to it as public school throughout all the other rules, the board rules. I think homeschool is distinct from school in most people's understanding. And by the fact that we've put the full phrase homeschool student in quotation marks, it sets it apart from something where you only have the definition of school.
Did you want to respond?
Well, I was just reading through the definition of homeschool student, and I think the way that I have felt that, at least myself, interpret the definitions that are set forth in 100 is that from now on, I would say homeschool student, not homeschool, or, I would use that phrase as it pertains to how it's defined here, and where it indicates that they attend a homeschool pursuant to the section of code and they're not counted in an LEA, by an LEA in membership, that is different enough from what we're defining as school below. This one, I'm kind of looking at as this is describing a student in a situation where the other one is intended to describe what we, the Board of Education, are going to start calling or move forward calling things when we call them a school. That becomes important as we're trying to match up schools as we expect them to have a report card or accountability requirements or assign the same number, and I can get into the reasons why we felt that was important if you're interested, but it was to try to distinguish between an actual school and who we're assigning school codes to versus other scenarios that might use the same kind of term. So, okay. I don't know if that helps.
Are you okay? Board Member Lear?
My concern is with the definition of alternative school.
Mike?
My concern is with the definition of alternative school. I know there have been groups, committees working on this for a year or two, and Natalie was saying this is what this group brought back, but I always have a problem with a definition that says a school in which all the students enrolled are eligible for special education. I think I'd prefer a definition that had 95% or 90% or at least 90% or something more specific than all that allowed the school to be, that allowed for the greatest breadth possible, because I think these schools do not lend themselves to the things that like report cards and can't remember the other things that they were. Mostly report cards. Is that the only main purpose of distinguishing?
If it's all right.
Hold on, let me just kind of get my last thought out, and then, so anyway, I would rather have a definition, and I don't want to just pull a number out of the air. I'd rather have you look at, and I thought this is what that group was doing, but look at 10 alternative schools and see what their percentages of, or those who purport to be schools that serve special education students, see what their percentage is. And then, so we can say, have at least 90% special education students. Hang on a minute. Let me just finish my complete thought. And then, so that's one of my concerns. I'd like it to be a little more flexible, give a little more breadth to this. I'd also like to add and you can't use that exactly, but Section 504 services. Because some of those types of schools have students who are both on IEPs and they have 504 plans. So I'm fine with every other definition in the rule, except I would rather see this a little more work on this and have this alternative school definition come back to us.
Yeah, yes, please.
Thank you. Aaron Bruff from Data and Statistics. So I just want to clarify. So you're looking at the definition of alternate, and then you're looking at I believe it's 3 categories underneath there. Is that correct?
4 categories.
4 categories. One of those being a special.
A school where all the students are enrolled, exclusively service, and exclusively is not a particularly great word either. A charter school whose key mission or purpose, that's okay. A district school, and again, I don't know if district school is defined anywhere. I'm not real crazy about that phrase anyway.
It is defined.
In which the primary purpose of the school is to provide or serve as an LEA's comprehensive dropout. That's okay. I'm mostly concerned with A and B. A and exclusively services. Just because they're so absolute.
And I know Leah is back, and she can answer this one too, but when you're looking at these special education service areas, they are all special ed students. Normally, Leah may be saying no, but I
Like a Dan Peterson or something.
Well, I mean, but what would you do with, I don't know that I want to debate the details right now. I'd rather have you come to me and say, Spectrum Academy has 95% special ed students on IEPs and 2% students with Section 504 plans, and Hardvixen School has, 102%. That's why I feel like I'm kind of, I don't know how desperate you are to get this definition passed, because I feel like it's not as data-driven as I would like it to be. No offense. I know it's hard. I know that there have been committees working on this for 2 years, so.
Did you want to?
Leah, can you just turn on the mic and introduce yourself?
Hi, Leah Voorhees, Assistant Superintendent of Student Support. So that particular definition we pulled from the special ed rules because special school under IDEA, one of the 5 placements, special school is a school in which the students, all of the students in the building are students with disabilities. They have no access to non-disabled peers. So that's just the definition of one of the 5 placements on the continuum, the placement of special school. That's where it came from.
But it's also being used for a different purpose. It's being used to have them avoid having to have a report card that is like other traditional schools. That's one of the purposes. There might be others. So I'm wanting it to. I realize where I hear you when you tell me where you took it from. But I'm saying, is this a good definition for a school we want excluded from that report card purposes? Is it adequate? Is it the best definition we should have?
Can I respond to that?
Sure.
So under the current rules, there are no schools that are excluded from the first run-through on the report card. All schools, alternate schools, special schools, they all get the initial run-through. And then we have the flags on those saying, is this an alternative setting? Is this a special school setting? So those then are removed and go through a different evaluation. So they are not just clarifying, they're not
To be technically
removed.
correct, you're exactly right,
Right.
Aaron, and I just didn't say that well. What I mean is they're not getting an A, B, C, D grade, which I know that all schools are not exactly getting an A, B, C, D grade, but they're being graded with a different construct than
Correct.
other schools are. And so I'm saying, even though this is where this came from, is it the best definition for all the purposes that alternative school will be used?
And Leah's shaking her head yes, and I would agree. As I've reviewed the data on these, absolutely. For a special school, it's 100%.
Is Spectrum Academy?
Maybe call it
Spectrum
special
Academy
school instead of
is not one.
Not a special school.
But I'm saying, I think it should be. That's my point. I think there are many schools, and I'm not
That
just.
are
I
close,
just
but-
I just
Yeah.
picked Spectrum out of the air, but it's probably 95% students on
definitely high.
IEPs,
Yeah.
or 90% students with IEPs, and another 5% have Section 504 plans. So my point is, if we're for the purpose that we want to designate alternative schools, I think this is too narrow if we really mean all the students, 100% of the students. And a school that exclusively services youth for whom the board is responsible. And that's more believable, but I do know that youth in custody programs sometimes have some other miscellaneous students in them. I
May I
think
ask
Ben wants to say
quick
something.
question of Member Lear?
Yes.
Would it address your concern if we change that to just, instead of having, in which it's all serves all students, have it say something about predominantly serve students of that? Or do you need a percentage there?
I think that's a guess. I don't mind that. I like that better, but I think it's just a guess. I mean, I think then.
Right, who
then-
determines what?
Then you've got, that's why I would like to look at, I would kind of like to do a reverse analysis and say, here is a range of schools, and you've probably already got that because a lot of those people came to those meetings and a lot of people made application, a lot of schools made application, and I'd rather look and see should those kinds of schools be in the different report card construct.
Mhm.
And I keep perseverating, to use your word, on Spectrum because I think it's an example of one of those schools that has no business being in the general report card process.
Okay.
And there are others. I'm just using that one because I know more about it.
This looks like we aren't going to finish, so I want to make sure all the board members have a chance. And then this is another one it looks like we'll be asking you to tweak. And so in between meetings, if you'll take those concerns or work on language of what you would like to see to be brought back. But I'm going to go to Board Member Davis unless you had something specific about, and then Board Member Cummins.
I know we're close to our hard stop, and this can be answered next time, but my question is about lines 68, 69, and 70. Brittany kind of mentioned this, but the definition of homeschool student, there are two pieces there: attends a homeschool and is not counted by an LEA in membership for purposes of generating state or federal funding. And yet we're also in the process of talking about the third-party vendors. And I met with a contractor who contracts the other day, and who works with thousands of students through charter and district LEAs. But I said, what percentage of the instruction is given or overseen or monitored by the parents at home? Or what percentage does that not happen? And he said 0.01%. It's all of them. So do we need two different definitions? Because these are parents who are homeschooling, but they don't fit the second half of that definition because they are accessing.
Board Member Davis, let me interrupt you a little bit because this will be to the board tomorrow. Because that portion of the definitions is not actually in there until we vote on it tomorrow. And so if you went back, if you wanted to talk to them right after the meeting, they could give you a little bit of history there, because I think those questions have been answered and they might be able to help you with that.
Okay, I just need to know if we need two groups.
Right.
One who doesn't access money from the LEA from the general fund, and one who
Yes,
does.
and those questions,
The one who shouldn't.
yeah, those questions were answered, so.
It's in here, I just missed it.
Yeah. Oh, somewhere.
So if, after the
Okay,
meeting,
they're
Brittany was on the committee and she could maybe talk to you for a second. Board Member Cummins?
So my only concern is we look forward for a different draft and we identify alternative school, just the clarification that every school receives a report card currently under the current regulation, but it's when they're identified for turnaround or for the bottom.
CSI.
Yeah, it's that bottom 3% or 5%. That's when this alternative status comes into play. Is that correct?
Mhm.
Okay, so it has nothing to do with the report card that they receive. It's just the status in turnaround in Title I, whatever
Correct.
that identification is.
There are other
Board Member Lear?
There are other rules that I recall that also refer to alternative schools. So that's
We
the
need to be
primary
consistent.
use for this, but there are other times when an alternative school is considered separately from a traditional school. And that's why it's important to me that we get the definition right, and I think we will find ourselves, what we'll find ourselves doing is waiving the rule to take care of a problem with the school I don't think that's necessary. I think we can get this, I think we can make this better.
Board Member Davis, did you have something else? Just checking.
We are at our hard stop, so absolutely not.
Well, I have 3 minutes showing on my clock.
I'm looking at that right there.
So, did you have any questions for further clarification from board members as we look at tweaking those a little bit?
What I wanted to ask is that in the realms of things that are time sensitive, this rule and the rule that we didn't get to are items that we're currently working on putting together for those who are on the IT Governance Council.
Right.
A presentation for the IT Governance Council that would, and is largely constructed around the definitions here and in the rule that we haven't gotten to yet. So we were hoping that we could get this passed so that as we worked through getting systems and resources developed to work on phase 2 of the report card to meet the statutory or the required deadline, that we could get those things done. And I realize that we're out of time, but what I wondered is if we could, without the next rule, it probably doesn't matter passing, but I wondered if it would be acceptable to remove the definition of alternative school until we could get the clarification necessary and pass the rest. But again, without the next rule that we didn't get to, it probably doesn't matter at this point. So.
I would support that completely. I
Right.
just want a little more work.
Make sure you're talking into the mic just so the public can hear.
I would still support that completely. I just would like to get, I think we can just do better for this definition. And my use of the report card example is only an example. It's not an exact example. I just think we need a good definition of this, finally.
And I apologize, I was told that the rest of the agenda items, there weren't any time constraints on them, so I would have rearranged if I had realized that was an issue, so thank you. And I'd be seeking a motion to do that, but it'd still have to go to the full board. Does that still work with the time?
That was our concern, is that this and the other rule have to go through at least another month of hearing and then 1 month of administrative rules before they could become effective. So it would be right up when we're starting fiscal years and when we need LEAs to change practices, so.
Okay.
The next rule?
Sorry, that's you.
I was told that we have to, it's my job to make sure we have a hard stop at 9. You're right, and our staff and security guards need to go home. So we need to end, but someone could make a motion. Brittany, come in.
So I move that we pass R277483 minus the alternative school. Oh, sorry, I'm on the wrong one. R277100 minus the alternative schools definition on first reading and send it to the full board for approval on second and final reading.
Okay, the motion on the table is to approve R277-100 minus the alternative school definition and move it to the full board for draft 2 and move it to the full board for approval. Any discussion to the motion? Seeing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? That passes unanimously. I'm looking for another motion.
Can I
Go
make
ahead.
a motion in regard to 483? Even though we didn't talk about it in committee, we've all had a chance to read it. Is that doable?
Yeah,
Okay.
we're 1 minute over.
Okay, I move that we approve R277483. Oh. They're, on
We
first,
have
they don't
public
wanna-
comment on that
Public
one.
comment is.
I think we probably
That's
should
fine.
wait, 'cause-
We can wait.
Yeah.
That's no worries.
Natalie?
Is it possible to have public comment in the next meeting and do the first and second reading in the committee next month? Is that something we do?
I don't know if we're allowed to do that.
Okay, we've passed the rule rolling, okay.
So, I didn't reach the end of the
Meeting, come on.
I need
Motion to
another motion to
adjourn.
adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
All right, all in favor?